one God that Jews would worship. Some Jews probably thought these other gods existed, but they weren't going to worship them. Other Jews thought, in fact, these other gods don't even exist. There's only one God. But Jews did insist on worshiping one God, the creator of the world, the one almighty God, the God who had chosen Israel to be his people. That's the God that's to be worshiped. And being Jewish in the days of Jesus meant worshiping that one God. Jews throughout the world thought that this one God had chosen Israel and given Israel its covenant. The word covenant means something like a peace accord or a peace treaty. A covenant was something that was given from a dominant nation to a lesser nation, and the idea was that God, the great power, had given the Jewish people an agreement. And the agreement was that God would protect and defend his people, that he would be their God if they would be his people. Okay? He'll be their God. He will protect and defend them if they'll be his people. This was the agreement. And so the Jewish people believed that this one God had made a special arrangement with them, the Jewish people. Part of that covenant was the law that God had given to the nation of Israel. The law indicated how Jews were supposed to worship God. It gave restrictions and directions for worship, and indicated how Jews were to relate to one another in their community. And so it's how they were to live together in community and how they were to worship God. Many of my students in the South, in the U.S. South, have a completely wrong idea of what traditional Jewish religion was all about. Many of my students think that the whole deal with Judaism was that God gave Jews a law that they could not possibly keep. And since they didn't keep this law, God sent them all to hell. And that's why Jesus showed up. It's because everybody was supposed to follow a law that they couldn't keep, and so they were all going to go to hell. And so Jesus came up to save them from hell. And that's the Jewish religion. It's a religion where everybody's going to go to hell because they've got this law. And this law is like this huge burden that people have to follow, and it's hard, and nobody can do it. And so that's a common view among my students, and it's completely wrong historically. The law given to Israel was not a particularly onerous law. It wasn't particular. I mean, you read through the law. You just read through the law in the Hebrew Bible. It is not a terribly difficult thing. I mean, it's not like American law. I mean, we have so many laws just controlling, like how you can drive a car, or what kind of things you can put in your mouth, or what. I mean, we have all these laws. I mean, so Jewish law is not. It wasn't like that. This was God telling you how you can worship him and how you can relate to each other. This is seen as the greatest good. I mean, can you imagine the creator of the universe telling you how you can live? It's fantastic. Well, Jews understood that the law had been given, and following the law was not in order to earn your way into heaven. It was how you live together as community in response to God who's given the covenant.
I'm going to rewind that. I think everybody should think about that for a second if they really believe Scripture. Do you believe that God gave this impossible law so that you could think, oh, this is impossible and this is terrible and it's a huge burden. Why do I have to do this stuff? I mean, this is like a joke, man. Like, oh, yeah. Like, we believe the Bible. We believe the Bible, and we believe God is the creator of the universe. And he's telling people how they should live their lives to be holy and pleasing and to go well with them. But how easily people just, oh, filthy old, that moldy old law that God gave. Well, can't keep it. It's trashy. We're trash no matter what, and he was really just trying to tell us we had to do something that we can't do. And then this thing we can't do, we're guilty of. And he's going to torch us forever because we can't do this thing that's this moldy old law that he doesn't really want us to do anyways, now that Jesus is dead and died and rose again, so but we're still guilty of it in a sense, right? And so God's going to murder you forever because you can't keep a law that's impossible. Something's wrong with this picture, man.
For worship, and indicated how Jews were to relate to one another. The Jewish people believed that this one God had made a special arrangement with them, the Jewish people. Part of that covenant was the law that God had given to the nation of Israel. The law indicated how Jews were supposed to worship God. It gave restrictions and directions for worship, and indicated how Jews were to relate to one another in their community. And so it's how they were to live together in community and how they were to worship God. Many of my students in the South, in the U.S. South, have a completely wrong idea of what traditional Jewish religion was all about. Many of my students think that the whole deal with Judaism was that God gave Jews a law that they could not possibly keep. And since they didn't keep this law, God sent them all to hell. And that's why Jesus showed up. It's because everybody was supposed to follow a law that they couldn't keep, and so they were all going to go to hell. And so Jesus came up to save them from hell. And that's the Jewish religion. It's a religion where everybody's going to go to hell because they've got this law. And this law is like this huge burden that people have to follow, and it's hard, and nobody can do it. And so that's a common view among my students, and it's completely wrong historically. The law given to Israel was not a particularly onerous law. It wasn't particular. I mean, you read through the law. You just read through the law in the Hebrew Bible. It is not a terribly difficult thing. I mean, it's not like American law. I mean, we have so many laws just controlling, like how you can drive a car, or what kind of things you can put in your mouth, or what. I mean, we have all these laws. I mean, so Jewish law it wasn't like that. This was God telling you how you can worship him and how you can relate to each other. This is seen as the greatest good. I mean, can you imagine the creator of the universe telling you how you can live? It's fantastic. Well, Jews understood that the law had been given, and following the law was not in order to earn your way into heaven. It was how you live together as community in response to God who's given the covenant. So, yeah, right. That's my 4-minute version of what it meant to be a Jew in the days of Jesus. So, Jesus had followers that eventually became Christianity. And the big question I want to struggle with in this lecture is, how did Jesus' followers after his day understand the relationship to this law that God had given, the law that's still found in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, the law of Moses? What is the relationship of the Christian to this law? Did God get rid of this law? Most Christians would say we still worship the God of Jesus. So, if that God gave the law, has he decided to rescind the law? Well, has he changed his mind, for example? That's the question. So I'm going to go through a number of options that we know about from early Christianity, a number of options for how one understands the relationship of the follower of Jesus to the law of the Jews. And so, option number 1. I'm going to begin at the sort of in the middle of the second Christian century. So we're talking 120 years after Jesus was dead. 120 years later, when we have some pretty good evidence about what some Christians were thinking about this particular issue. I'm going to begin with a group of Christians called the Marcionites. They were called the Marcionites because they were followers of a particular theologian, philosopher, whose name just happened to be Marcion. Marcion. The Marcionites were a very interesting and distinctive group because Marcion himself had a very distinctive and interesting teaching. Marcion was particularly obsessed with the Apostle Paul and the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul taught that Christ had saved people by his death and his resurrection. And Paul differentiated between the gospel of Christ, which brings salvation, and the law of the Jews that brings condemnation. This is, my students resonate with this. So Paul, the law of the Jews brings condemnation. The gospel of Christ brings salvation. Paul differentiated between the law and the gospel, and Marcion took very close note of that. Marcion maintained that the God who gave the law cannot be the same God who brought salvation. The God of the Hebrew Bible, of what Christians would call the Old Testament, the Old Testament God is actually a different God from the God of Jesus. Marcion wrote a book called The Antitheses, the Contrary Statements, where he tried to show that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. So, for example, he points out that in the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament tells the children of Israel they're supposed to take the promised land. Well, the problem is somebody already lives in the promised land. So how are we supposed to have the promised land? Well, you've got to kill the people who are in there. Really? Yes. So Joshua chapter 6, God commands the troops under Joshua to go in and take the city of Jericho. You know the story. They're supposed to march around the city once a day for 6 days. Seventh day, they march around 7 times. They blow the trumpets, they shout, and the walls will come tumbling down, and it happens. And God says, go into the city and murder every man, woman, and child in the city. Marcion tells the story, and then he says, is this the same God that says, love your enemy? If somebody persecutes you, pray for them. If somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. No, that's not the same God. They're different gods. You've got a wrathful God in the Old Testament, and you've got a merciful God in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you have the prophet Elisha, a man of God, who's walking by a group of boys, and these boys start making fun of him. He's going bald. And so they call out, Baldy, Baldy. And Elisha calls the wrath of God down. And 2 she-bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of them to death. Is this the same God who says, let the little children come unto me? No, it's not the same God. It's a different God. Marcion literally thought there were 2 gods. Literally thought there were 2 gods. The God of the Old Testament was the God who created this world and chose Israel and gave them the law, and the God of Jesus is the God who saves people from that God. They're 2 separate gods. Jesus does not belong to the Creator God. Jesus wasn't even a material being in this world, because if Jesus had been born of the union of Joseph and Mary and been born like everybody else, he'd be a creature like everybody else, which would mean he'd belong to the Creator like everyone else. So Jesus was never born. Jesus descended from heaven as a full-grown man and wasn't really a fleshly human being because he didn't belong to the Creator. Why didn't Marcion simply read the New Testament to realize it wasn't that way? There wasn't a New Testament. It didn't exist yet. Of course, the books that later were put into the New Testament existed, but there wasn't a canon of Scripture yet. Marcion may well have been the first Christian to devise a canon. He had something like our Gospel of Luke, and he had something like 10 of our letters of Paul, and that was it. His Bible didn't have 66 books in it, the way the Christian Bible typically has. He had 11 books. No Old Testament. That's the book for the Jews. Well, whatever you think of that, it's a rather elegant solution about what to do about the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament. You simply get rid of the Old Testament. At the same time Marcion was doing this, there was another group of Christians known as the Ebionites. The Ebionites did not share Marcion's high praise of Paul. The Ebionites thought that Paul was the arch heretic who got everything wrong. He got everything wrong because he didn't understand the relationship of the gospel of Christ to the law of the Jews. Among other things, the Ebionites wanted to insist that there's only one God. Marcion's wrong, and anybody who thinks there's more than one God is completely wrong. These are radical monotheists. They're radical monotheists in part because they are very serious about their Jewish commitments. Jesus for the Ebionites was the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. So this religion, this following Jesus, is completely Jewish for the Ebionites. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, then of course you have to follow the Jewish law. And so the Ebionites insisted that in fact the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, that is the Bible. Now, they may have had other books as well. Some people think they had something like the Gospel of Matthew, which is widely considered to be the most Jewish of our Gospels. They may have had other books, but they certainly had the Jewish Bible. For them, Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism, but that didn't mean you got rid of Judaism. Christianity was the correct interpretation of Judaism, and so Ebionites were Jews, and they continued to be Jews. They circumcised their babies, they kept kosher, they observed Sabbath, they followed the festivals, they were Jewish. This is a pretty stark contrast with Marcion. They contrast up and down the line. Marcion thinks there's two gods, the Ebionites think there's one God. Marcion thinks that Paul's the hero, the Ebionites think Paul's the heretic. Marcionites think that Jesus was a divine being, but not a human being. The Ebionites think he's a human Messiah, not a divine being. The Marcionites have something like the Gospel of Luke. The Ebionites have something like the Gospel of Matthew. The Marcionites don't have the Old Testament. The Ebionites do have the Old Testament. I know Christians who line up on one or the other side today. I know Christians who... of course, I know Christians who insist that who are still Jewish, who maintain their Jewishness. At least they say they do. The Messianic Jews who understand themselves to be both Jewish and Christian. I know a lot of other Christians who think that they've never heard of Marcion, but if they had heard of Marcion, they would think that he was onto something, because you have the Old Testament God of wrath and the New Testament God of love, and that just makes inherent sense for a lot of people who aren't quite sure why they have an Old Testament, but you know they have it. And so you have people on both sides. Well, there are other options. Here's a third option that you have from the ancient world from about the same time as these groups, the letter of Barnabas. The letter of Barnabas was probably written in the 130s, a little bit before Marcion was doing his thing. The letter of Barnabas almost made it into the New Testament. There were church fathers who thought the letter of Barnabas belonged in the New Testament. I think we can be very grateful it didn't make its way into the New Testament, because this book is more anti-Jewish than anything that did make it into the New Testament. Barnabas, the letter of Barnabas is principally about how to understand the relationship of the followers of Jesus and the Jewish people, and how to understand the relationship between the followers of Jesus and the Jewish law. Barnabas maintains that the Jews had been given the covenant of God with the law under Moses, but they broke the covenant just as soon as they got it. And so Barnabas tells the story about how in the Old Testament, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, and God gives him the 2 tablets of the law, the 10 commandments. And then he learns that the people down below are making idols for themselves and engaging in wild activities. And he comes down and he sees what's going on. He throws down the 2 tablets of the law and smashes them. Barnabas says this indicates that the Jews literally broke their covenant. The Israelites broke the covenant, and for Barnabas, it was never restored. Jews who had just had the covenant made with them broke it. Jews, for Barnabas, never have been the people of God. Okay? What about the law? Barnabas maintains that since Jews were never the people of God, they never understood the law that God gave them.
He chose poorly.
They never understood their own law. Much of Barnabas, this letter of Barnabas, is designed to show what the true interpretation of the law is, and to show how the Jews have misinterpreted their law. They've misinterpreted their law because they've taken their law literally. But God never meant the law to be taken literally. And Barnabas shows how this is by going through a whole bunch of laws to show how these have been misunderstood. For example, kosher food laws. When the Bible says, don't eat pork, it doesn't mean don't have ham sandwiches. That's a literal interpretation. That's not what it means. Not partaking of pork means not behaving like pigs. For Barnabas, that means this. Pigs, when they're hungry, grunt and make a ton of noise. When they're fed, they don't. You should not be like that. You should not pray to God whenever you are in desperate need, and then when your needs are satisfied, you have no communication with God. You should pray to God all the time. Don't behave like a pig. That's what it means. Don't eat pork. Barnabas goes through a number of the kosher food laws and gives the correct interpretation that those Jews have never understood. The Sabbath day. Jews say you should not work on Saturday. You should observe the Sabbath. They completely misunderstand, according to Barnabas. Barnabas points out that the Sabbath day requirement is rooted in the creation.
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
Have you been getting on now? Are you able to get on more often, or?
Well, I've been out of it sleeping a lot, and so a lot of times I'm just laying here listening. Like when you guys were on Linda's, I was there. I was zonked out, so I was just listening. But then, so I was awake enough to go ahead and come on a little bit, and then I was wondering why you weren't letting me in, and then I scrolled down and it said to enter, so I didn't hit that last
Oh,
Think
okay.
so you didn't see me, obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so this sounds like a really good one. Did you play this one before?
I have a while ago. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think. I mean, I don't agree with Bart Ehrman on many things, but he makes points that I would agree with sometimes when he's just talking about the scripture. So, you know,
Well, yeah, right off the bat. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like when you think about it, it's obvious that there's something wrong with the way people often think about this sort of thing. Even I would say I think about it probably wrong sometimes. Like, seems like doesn't make sense to completely just like I still struggle with this idea, right? Like when you look at what God says about the law, like you can't keep it, and like there's a sense that's like I just sometimes I wonder about how we should really come at this idea, like to think God, the creator of the universe, like gives these people directions on how to live, like to be like Him or whatever, and we kind of look at it like, yeah, okay, wink, wink, whatever, like. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, he's going to punish you for something he doesn't think you can do. And it's like, that's kind of weird, I guess. I don't know. I'm not sure how to think about it.
Well, I think even more so, like when because we're on YouTube so much, and we're hearing so many different theories, and we're hearing atheists, and we're hearing hyper grace theories or whatever, and it's a constant like, what is your mind being renewed on? And I always think about Romans 12, 1 to 2, um, to be transformed. You need to renew your mind on truth, right? And not and so what I see a lot is that, sure, you're going to get thoughts that say, oh gosh, I've struggled with this a long time and I can't do it. And well, we're sinners anyway, and we're weak and we're still in our flesh, right? And there's so many temptations. Well, when a lot of times what I've seen is people that um, they get tired of, I guess, the war, and so they hear doctrine that gives them a relief, like, oh, okay, great. There's this universalism or hyper grace, and it's really okay. I'm okay. I can be happy and just say it's finished, and I don't have to war anymore, because it's all finished. Everything, it's finished, you know. And even if for those that are all, following Paul, like Ace and them that don't take on the red words, that's not what Paul said. Paul was warring to the very end, you know, putting on the armor and battling the flesh and putting on the new man and off the old man and being renewed in the word daily. So yeah.
Yeah, it's you have to wonder, like I have no I'm thoroughly convinced of what I think Paul is saying, like what you're describing. And it's like the people who reject Paul are like, it's so frustrating to me because like the reasons they're rejecting Paul is like they're just actually it's like everybody's in cahoots. It's like, no, Paul really is saying, like people often say, and then they're rejecting Paul. It's kind of this weird, like everybody's conspiring against what Paul's actually teaching. It's very strange. I guess you could say it's I don't know, the great deception. I don't know. I don't want to be like over the top with it, but it doesn't make
Well,
sense.
yeah, and in my opinion, they overemphasize a few things that Paul was addressing to legalists. You know, he said a few things about legalists that really were bound by the law and didn't understand that now that we have that in our heart, that we're not doing it mechanically and that the law's written on our heart. But if you look around our world or even just in this small community on YouTube, for the most part, people are not bound by legalism. They are not just like hyper obeying every little rule and not playing cards, and they're not crazy as far as rule keeping. If anything, they're the other extreme. So when I look, and the word confirms that in these last days, I'm sorry if I'm screaming. the word confirms that in these last days, that's what we're going to see is more lawlessness. You know, when you read like I know I say it all the time, but in 2 Timothy 3, the characteristics there, it's not legalism, it's lawlessness. You know, and
Yeah, yeah. The whole itching ears thing. I'm going to talk about that next when I do a stream. It's like,
yeah, I
what
think that's
do people think
yeah,
they're talking about there? They think they're talking
right,
about that I have itching ears to think I am like struggling with sin and want to obey God's commandments. It's like, no, itching ears
right,
is like thinking everything's fine no matter what and you're good, because that's what the flesh wants to hear.
right. I always think of it as a Xanax to like mute your conscience. You know, you have a little bit, maybe hopefully
Ooh, I lost you,
something
Jenny.
is, oh,
There you go. There you're back.
okay. They have conscience, you know, it's a battle of the conscience. They're feeling a little bit of guilt, but it's like, oh, instead of getting rid of the sin and turning to the word and trusting the Holy Spirit to empower them to change them, they want to mute that voice of the conscience, you know, and then hold on to the teachers that will say, you're okay, you're wonderful. Just, we're all in a big mess, so it's okay, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to know how to, especially when you like deal with the same people over and over a lot of the time, and it's hard to be like to be, I get kind of apathetic about it in a way, right? It's probably not good, and I think, yeah, it's like I can identify with people even if they have slightly different views, but it's like it is difficult to parse out exactly how to look at a thing. It's like you kind of need to come at it from the well, I don't know. There's so many different ways that people come at it, and yeah, like you said, just
Well, like, have you noticed when you're on Ace, like you're talking to Ace, and I saw this yesterday or the day before with Bruce too. Most of the time, your questions, your comments are completely ignored. There's a flow chart that's going to happen, and they are going to present their questions. They're always going to bring it back to their verse, no matter what you say. You know
yeah.
what I'm saying?
I've been noticing that lately too, where I'm like, I'm a little bit,
So you can't get anywhere. You know.
yeah. I'm just like I'll say something and like I've been starting to ask people like, do you like answer that question like, or like, can you? It's like nobody's even actually listening. Is the reality of what I'm saying? So it's they're not actually engaging, because I'll be like, because I tested it a few times and I'm like, can you respond to what I was saying? Like, what's your response? And I'm just like, wait, what did you say? Like every time I ask it, that's what the response I get. Everybody just is waiting their turn to say what they're gonna say, I guess. They're not actually engaging half the time at all. And then I wonder, because I know like I sometimes struggle to explain what I'm saying and I'm a little bit scattered or whatever, but that's why I usually go on and on, because I feel like at least get it out what I'm trying to say to a point where someone can understand. Maybe they've just given up at that point, but it leaves you wondering. It'd be nice to be able to just like ask questions if they don't actually understand what you're saying or something, but I don't know. Maybe that's
It's sort of like, have you ever been to, like, let's say a used car lot, or anytime you're in a situation when you have a pushy salesperson, they're not all that concerned with your concerns, but they want to make sure you hear their main points, right? That's going to convince you that you need what they have. And that's what I feel goes on there.
Yeah. It drives me into just, I think that's part of the reason why I'm kind of a jackass some of the time, I guess I would say. Like it's a sympathy. It's just like, maybe somebody will listen to what I'm saying but even if you like kind of try to make a joke about it, like in a sense where they'll like get the point or whatever, make like I don't know what you call it, but it's like displaying the absurdity of what they're saying by like taking it to its logical conclusion and then making a statement that on what they're saying. And I don't know if people don't get it half the time what I'm saying, but it's hard to get someone to engage. I mean, I get it once in a while and sometimes,
Okay. Can I just briefly go over a couple scriptures, just like,
yeah, please do.
about I won't read like the whole passages or anything, but just to show you how much it says
can.
about us being able to obey the if we can obey or not. Okay, that's what he started out with on this video, is can we obey the instructions, right? So I use a lot of times the one in Romans 6:14, sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace, right? So grace is there so that we are not under the dominion of sin, right? Right there in Romans. And I think they accept Romans over there on ACES. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is the one that says that God will make a way of escape. In Galatians 5:16, where it talks about walking in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of your flesh. Romans 6:22 says we're being made free from sin. 2 Peter 2:9 says that the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation. 2 Thessalonians 3:3 says the Lord is faithful, who shall establish you and keep you from evil. James 4:7 says, submit yourself to God, resist the devil, and he will flee. 1 John 5:4 says, whoever is born of God overcomes the world. 1 Peter 1:22 says, seeing that you've purified your souls in obeying the truth. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So obviously it wouldn't say that these people won't suffer persecution that are living godly if it wasn't possible that we could live godly, right? 2 Corinthians 7:1 says, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and the spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Well, all these assume that it's possible to do these things.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I think sometimes people, not all of them, because most people I think are more, at least sometimes more honest than this, I guess I would say. In that,
Hey,
yeah,
can
go
I ask
ahead.
a question? Can I ask a
Sure.
question real quick? Uh, well, you just read so much scripture. You went from verse to verse to verse to verse. Um, why not just stick to one thing at a time? Because every single of those verses should be meditated on.
Oh, I totally agree. And you know, the reason I do is because I'm very frail and I have a very short time to come on here. So I figured if I can give a list like that, that people can then look at those on their own time. Because I know that I'll never be able to be on here enough to do service to any of them. But if people can have at least, I don't know what I read, maybe, 10, they can look at them themselves and read them in context, read the whole chapter, and meditate on it. Because that's exactly what I was saying about Romans 12:1-2, is that we need to meditate on those. To be transformed, you need to renew your mind. And that's when you see all these, and, these are in my mind all the time. Whenever I hear lawlessness, these are the things that come to my mind. And that helps me realize that, yes, God has empowered me, that I don't have to be under this sin, that I'm released from the bondage of sin. So, yeah.
Yuri, come back in a little bit. I want to talk to Janet because I haven't gotten to talk to her for a while. I'm not trying to be mean. I just
Yeah, I won't be able to stay on long because I get really tired. So, yeah, I won't stay long.
So I'm not trying to be rude or mean. Just come back, all right? Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm glad he did mention that, though.
Yeah. I don't want to get out of control with that. Yeah, I think, I'm realizing, like, some of these, sometimes, like, and I haven't done this for a while, but I remember a while ago on Praise's channel, I asked, like, that one Asian guy, whatever his name was, the one that was kind of kooky or whatever, that was, I don't know him. I had run-ins with him a few times, but I remember thinking, it struck me one day, and I asked him, and there's a lot of people in the room, and then I was kind of surprised how other people didn't have an answer. I said, like, what do you like? What do you how do you define righteousness? What is righteousness? They don't know.
Oh,
You know,
yeah,
they
I
don't
think
know
I'm
what that means.
right.
They
Yeah.
just see it as Christ is our righteousness. But like, if you had to like get them, and I don't mean this to be mean or rude or whatever, and maybe some of them know, they just don't know what to say, how to say it or something. But there is a level of like, to me, that's easy. That's like the fruits of the spirit and walking after the commandments of God, and Jesus is righteous because of the, not just because he's declared or it's said that he is, so we just say it. It's because he never sinned, and he loved people, and he showed the fruits of the spirit, and he, you know,
Yeah.
it's not just keeping the commandments. It's not, you know, but you don't break them when you
Right.
love people, and so it's
And
there's
it
more to
includes,
it. Yeah,
yeah, it includes 1 Corinthians 13, right? Because
yeah,
where it explains what love looks like, you know.
yeah. Exactly, yeah, and people like just kind of forget that because they're used to saying is like, I think so. I think when they read a lot of those passages that you read, which should be actually fairly obvious what they're saying, they didn't
Yeah.
detach, you know, walking in the image of God and walking after the ways of Christ.
Okay. Yeah.
You know,
Answer
it's
me
separate.
that. Do you think that maybe part of the problem is that online it's a strong debate community, and that people, when they go to the word, they're looking for their strong points to debate whoever they're debating. You know, they're
Yeah,
being questioned, and they want to have an answer for whoever, and so they're always looking for a gotcha, but they're not. And especially if they've only been saved a couple of years or 3, they don't know so many of the basics about the instructions.
no, you can tell. No, it's obvious, and I know you can tell too. I've always like you know, read my Bible, like, and not just memory verses or whatever, but like you get on little, at least I've gotten on where I'll go like months without really reading it every day or whatever. And you start to like kind of, you can start to forget like the overall context of a certain
Yeah.
section of scripture. And so I know that's true from my own personal experience.
Yeah.
And you know, if you're actually reading your Bible, you know, you notice who doesn't read their Bible, because like, yeah,
Right.
and that's the thing, you start getting in that kind of mindset of just like proof texting. It's a very Protestant phenomenon,
Right.
that would argue. And yes, it's fairly obvious that, because if people read their, it's just like, you know, it's one thing to be OSAS and have that background or whatever, but a lot of them aren't so rabid in the way they fight people that are, you know, talk like, say, one of us do. And so those people actually probably, you know, you tell they actually read scripture, they know what it says and the context, and they can't just divorce these concepts from the context. And so it starts to become obvious that when people are just absolutely not reading it, because when you
Right.
read it, it's clear what the message is. The message is, you know, you're saved by grace through faith, trusting in Jesus, but they never ever divorce language of like living a godly life and loving people and keeping his commandments. And
Right.
you know, Christians say things like, you know, and I'm guilty of this too. Anybody can be. When you feel confronted or whatever, it's hard to be humble all the time. But you know, if you stop and just read like the early Christians, and you read what the Bible's saying, what Paul said, it's like a Christian doesn't say, well, how many times can I sin before I lose my salvation? Ha ha, you know, whatever. They would
Yeah.
never say that. They would be like,
Right.
am I sinning against God? And they would be like, you know, repentant, or like they would take consideration of what someone's saying. And see, and then because there's none of that going on, and I'm not like some perfect example, but I'm saying like, you know, you guys are right when you say you just got to like start to avoid it more, because you just start, it's a just constant, you know, pride and not being humble and not actually caring
Yeah.
about
And
what God says, you know?
so, you know, instead of like the wise one is the one that can win the debate, this is what it says. And I know you know the scripture. I'm not telling you anything new, but just to look at it, in 2 Timothy 3, where it says, um, you know, they're talking about all these things in the last days about evil men waxing worse and worse. But it says, continue in the things that thou hast learned. Um, and you know how the holy scriptures are able to make you wise through unto salvation. Then in 16, that's what I wanted to get to. All scripture is given by inspiration of God. Okay, so this is what it's for. It's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Right? That the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works.
Oh dear, perfect. No, couldn't be.
Woo! Ouch.
Dear me. It's not like God, all things are possible, with God or something. It couldn't be that. God, Jesus couldn't help you overcome or anything. That would be a work salvation.
And
I think sometimes they think I think some people too, and I've seen people respond to this, they'll say, I hate to always be saying that what people do or that's wrong or whatever, when I can focus on myself a little more, but just that, I think people will actually think someone's walking after the flesh when they're wanting to obey God. Like, I don't really look at it that way. I guess it is possible to walk around like you're so good, in your obedience or something and become off track. But I don't think that's the normal context of like walking after the flesh. It's like the lusts of the flesh. That's the way I understand it, anyway.
Yeah.
Like it's walking with the power of God, like, in the spirit or whatever. You can say it that way too, I would say. But I don't know that it's always easy to distinguish it. I mean, sometimes I wonder if walking in the spirit is just like staying connected to God through prayer. And it's like, I don't know, I'm not, some people make it more of this like kind of incoherent, or not incoherent, but incomprehensible thing, which in a way it kind of is in the language or whatever. But sometimes I wonder if, it's just like abiding in Christ and you have the spirit or something. I don't know.
It's not spooky. That's the way I say it. It's not spooky, right? To walk in the spirit.
Yeah, right.
It's not spooky. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand like different ways people think about it, and I'm fine with that. Like like when Kenny talks about it, I wouldn't talk about it quite exactly the way, but I get, I know what text he's talking about, and I don't totally discount that way of talking about it or think it's wrong or anything. I just
when we walk,
I'm sorry.
No. When we walk in the spirit in Galatians 5, the fruit of the spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. So that's what it'll look like, right?
Right.
If we're walking in the spirit.
Yeah. I do, and I don't want to be misunderstood if anybody hears this, that I'm saying like, I'm not saying you have to like work for it. Like there's a sense where you're like kind of surrendering to like the influence and the person of Christ as you see it in Scripture. And when you stay connected with God through prayer, like I hear people say all the time, like being saved has nothing to do with like having to like read your Bible every day and like pray so many times a day. And I kind of get what they're saying, but it's like to think that you can like have a relationship with God without doing those things would be a bigger mistake than, you don't want to make it like a systemized thing, but it still is. You have to connect with God through prayer and reading Scripture and like thinking about Christ.
It's a balance because we have a flesh and we do have to, like Paul talks about being good soldiers and enduring hardness. And you do have to sometimes, like, I'll say, Janet, it's enough. Now stop that. And you're going to go do this, But also it's that, but it's also like I'll say, there's part of that surrender where I'll say, I cannot do this, Lord. I can't. I stop. You've got to live it through me. It's both to me. It's
exactly. That's the grace and the abiding and the surrendering and the humbling yourself.
Yeah. Hi, James.
It's hard for men because I have, I get on here too much lately too because I haven't been working last week or two, but I will be soon. So
when do you go back?
Well, I'll be at home until this winter's over. Probably. I don't have anything lined up for work right now, but as far as doing any jobs, but I have working on the house here, so quite a bit to do. Well, as soon as my dad gets it going, I guess. But it's all insulated now. So.
Good.
Hey, Nancy, what's up?
I just thought I'd stop in to say hi to Janet. I haven't talked to her for a while.
Hi, honey.
Hi.
Yeah. How did we both get fooled today?
I don't know how that happened. I'm not sure. I think it was so weird because I got like 3 messages today about you need to. I mean, Big Perm somehow sent me a message through my YouTube channel, and it
Yeah.
was like, oh, okay. I'm like, Loken's going to be on, and I guess Bruce said something about Loken on the topic on his thing, and I'm like, okay, that wasn't Loken.
Well, I
Did
was
you?
looking at him and the voice was completely different, but then everybody was telling me that I was wrong. And at the end, when I played it fast, when I was finishing it, because I fell asleep, it did sound like his voice.
I couldn't see that. I mean, it's like he didn't admit he was Loken. That I noticed or anything like that. I mean, I don't want to talk about Loken, but you read what I said on
Yeah.
my email message.
But it
And
is his eyebrows and his eyes. Did you notice that? His
Pardon?
eyebrows and his eyes. His eyebrows and his eyes.
Say it again.
His eyebrows and his eyes are Logan.
I have to go back and look. Well, I don't even know. I think Bruce probably dropped the channel. He always does. So, I mean, it didn't sound like him. Not at all. I mean,
I just feel so weird about the whole thing, Nancy. It's just weird.
It did not. I mean, it wasn't any type of a personality of Loken or his mannerism or his cadence of his voice or anything.
I
thought
know. It's strange.
It was a different person.
Somebody's pulling our leg, and I'm not sure.
Well, it could have been a person named Loken, Who knows? But why would Bruce post it like that before he ever even opened up the channel? I don't even know why.
You know what's weird? I just went to your channel and saw that on your feature people on your channel, which doesn't have my channel on it, by the way, which is disappointing. I'm just kidding. But this chaplain Bob Walker.
Who are you talking?
You.
Okay. What about
He's
him?
on your featured channel. That's so weird because I haven't seen that guy for years, but I recognize that guy. I used to see him in chats all the time and I've been around him a little bit.
Bob Walker was a very close personal friend of mine. I knew him about 10 years ago. And actually, he came and visited with me numerous times, and he was storing certain things at my house, and he paid me to have storage and everything like that. And he came and visited with me about 4 or 5 times, and we were very close friends until he realized that I didn't believe in Paul anymore. And then he told one of his people on his channel, he says, anybody that doesn't believe in Paul should be killed.
Oh, wow. What a weirdo.
I freaked out. It's like, oh my God. And then he blocked me from everything. And I'm like, I mean, there was no discussion, no conversation. And this one lady said that he said something to her, and then he said that to me. Well, he didn't say that to me, but he had told her that he believed that, and I freaked out, and then he blocked me. So, but yeah, Bob Walker.
I played a video earlier that's about, I've played it before, and I like to play it every once in a while because hoping other people will actually hear it or listen to it and realize certain things about the early church. It's a very good overview of some of the things that give you a good idea of what the early church was saying about it's on eternal security, right? Because a lot of people say a lot of wacky things that just don't seem to be true at all, and they never substantiate it about that to make it seem ambiguous about, I don't think they were perfect in their beliefs, but what would we expect, right? As it faded further and further from the church that was established by the apostles. But I think when you actually look at the things people were saying, there's quite a bit to look at. And when you look at what the majority of early church fathers were saying against the Gnostics and why, And the things that the majority of them seem to affirm pretty positively, as far as like, that's not true, this is true. It's really,
I'm not hearing you at all.
Yeah, he went bye-bye.
Yeah.
Hi, John. I just saw
He's
John.
still talking, but he's not. There's nothing going. I got on with, whose channel was I on? I think, it was Linda's channel.
Type in and let him know in here.
Yeah, I got on Linda's channel about an hour or so ago, and Jamie joined me, but I was talking with Bruce. Did you hear anything that I said, Jamie, earlier to Bruce about getting onto this guy's channel that had like about 200,000 viewers?
Yeah, a little bit. I caught the last part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I sent Jamie a or not Jamie, but Janet a message about, who the guy was and everything like that. But it's going to take probably about 4 or 5 people that are going to blast him at the same time to, befuddle him.
Nancy, I did send that to Bruce. I wasn't sure if you were going to also, but I went ahead and I sent him that link.
I've never tried to, contact Bruce.
Okay. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I just, this guy has been saying this horse crap for 10 years or 15 years now. And it's like, it's like
tell us again. I must have missed that part. So tell me.
Well, it's like he's got 200 and some thousand viewers. And I became a personal friend of his, not a real, I've never met him or anything. He lives in northern Alabama. I could go meet him, but I fear doing that because it's like at one point in time, and we had a friendship that could have been, a little bit more closer, but it was like God screwed up the whole thing. Every time that we texted each other or whatever, it's like the messages were scrambled for no damn reason at all. It was just so weird. And then I found out that he was so bizarre and off the wall and believing in like Marcionism and weird crap that it's like he's like, communicating with aliens, for crying out loud. And literally, that's like, who in the heck are you? And he's got this following. And he says he believes in Jesus, he believes in Paul, he believes in this, he believes in that, but he believes that the Old Testament God is like an evil God, like Marcion taught, in the 2nd century, and that he's not the father of Jesus Christ. And he just, he's got all these made up theories and everything like that. And it's like, it's like, holy cow. What the hell are you thinking? And
this is what happens online. This is what happens online because people get, when YouTube was, I think earlier, a lot of people that just, like if you do a video, it's not so much anymore, but if you do a video about aliens and so many people are so interested in that subject and confused about how it relates to Christianity and it's exciting and weird beliefs come out of that.
Yeah, and it's like I'm like listening to this stuff, and I was ahead of him the whole time. Every time he talked about this and this and this and all these theories and beliefs that he had, it's like I would go ahead and I would, by some way, somehow, some chance, I would come up with, well, this is what he's believing. This is where he got it from. And I would confront him with it, and he would say, no, this isn't what I believe. And today he admitted it. He admitted to me on the phone that he believed in the doctrine of Simon Magus and Marcion. Now, can you believe that? And then he spent 45 or 50 minutes trying to convince me of it. And I just sat there and listened, and made my comments. And finally, I made one final comment to him. I said, well, didn't Jesus say, because I remembered, 10 years ago that he told me, I have not come but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I said, do you also know what else he said? He said, Jesus also said, do to his disciples, he says, do not go to the Gentiles and do not go to the Samaritans. And he was quiet. Huh? I said, well, Simon Magus was a Samaritan. I never heard that before. Oh, yeah. So that was the end of our conversation. He said he would study it.
What I see a lot of times is like people that they're bored with anything that is traditional, and they're always looking for something for a change. It's got to be something new and exciting. And,
Yeah, it's actually really interesting and disappointing because, hey guys, hey Buckle, hey Peter, good to see you. Everybody is out there. So yeah, I think this is a kind of and it's easy to get sucked into because it is fascinating, especially for men. It seems that anything to do with angels and aliens, and so the Book of Enoch. And then somebody starts getting into it, and then they kind of feel like they know stuff that other people don't know, and then they start teaching about it, and then they get kind of like they know something, and then people are interested in it, and they get popular. I mean, that's the problem with YouTube, right? It kind of conditions you, and you feel, everybody. I do. If more people paying attention, that it's makes you feel like you people want to hear what you have to say, and it's nice to have, it's nice to have that response. And I think it can only imagine that it conditions people, and then they get going in these weird areas, and then they feel like they know something special. And it's like with the Enoch thing, it's just like people are so ignorant, and I don't mean this to be disparaging or sound important or something, but because I'm still learning about it. But I've learned a lot over the last few years, especially with just better ways of understanding Scripture and better ways of understanding genre in Scripture. And it's like to even go to the Book of Enoch without having even a clue about how to read apocalyptic literature is scary, man. And I don't know. I want to do more study on that because people are so confused. I'm realizing about just how to read.
You have a good point. You have a good point, Jamie. And one thing that troubles me is that there is one person out there, and I've met him personally in Pensacola, and he's very popular. You've heard of Paul Bigley? Is anybody here?
Yeah, I remember him. He had a catchphrase, didn't he? He was like,
yeah,
that's amazing, or something.
Yeah.
What did he say?
Yeah. He one of the people that he's very well linked with is Stephen Ben-Nun, Israeli News Live.
I used to watch both of them way back. Yeah.
Yep, me too.
Yeah. Well, I lived down here in Mobile, Alabama for a long time, and Stephen Ben-Nun lived over somewhere in the Florida area, and he had a small conference at one point in time in Pensacola about 5 years ago. And
he did like Israel News, right? Israel Update News kind of thing.
Israeli
right?
News Live, right? And so he had this little small conference, at a small hotel or whatever over there. And so I signed up for the conference, and I went over there, and I got to meet him. And there was only like 15 people there that day. So I got to speak with him face to face. And it was interesting, and I was a little nervous and whatever. And because I had, called him on certain things that he had said on some of his, videos or whatever. And he'd like come back, well, Sister Nancy or whatever he would call me. And anyhow, so I came there, and he was ex-CIA. And, I have been in the military. I had a top secret security clearance because I was a historian with the military. And I know how difficult that is to go and get a top secret security clearance. And he's CIA. And I mean, there are different levels of security clearances. I was probably at the bottom of the barrel somewhere down there, but I had I had a reason to know everything, and nobody could deny me any access to anything. But I'm thinking to myself, he gets on all of these shows all the time. He goes to all these conferences all over the nation. He exposes himself. He has all these connections with, the CIA and all these people that he says he knows in, how do you want to say it, in the Pentagon and this and that. And he tells all this information. But yet he's like, well, I'm no longer CIA. What? I mean, every time he gets on the telephone and every time he talks to anybody, but I can't tell you this information because it's classified, or people should know this stuff. I mean, it's like, I mean, if this stuff is even a possibility of having some type of, really depth of information, and then he's like, I almost got my whole internet system taken down and the whole 9 yards, and all these things are happening to my family. I'm thinking, wait a minute. They can track him anywhere he goes. They can take him out in a heartbeat. And if he's, having contact with any of these people that he says that has, semi, whatever information, they know exactly who he's talking to. I mean, if everything's being censored,
that doesn't strike me as something. I think people are weird, man. I think people and I don't necessarily think that right away on people, but I'm just going to be skeptical because, it's like there's kind of a condition psychologically where people imagine these kind of things, and then pretty soon they convince themselves that that's what's going on. I mean, there's my friend.
He's got
this issue.
He's got information, but what is he trying to do? Is he a government agent that is trying to draw people to him to go and get them censored, or get their data and information, like you and I or something like that have tuned into his channel? And is he a real person, or is he still a CIA agent? I mean, once CIA, I don't think you ever get out of the CIA, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, sure. Yeah, I just think if you have like information you're trying to distribute or something and then somebody talks to you about it. I don't know. I've heard that. I remember I stopped listening to that guy essentially, because I had a life, but partly I remember one day I was kind of shocked when he was just like declaring matter of factly that like God never wanted them to do, like that God never gave them the directions to do animal sacrifices. And he used that one verse. It was one of the first times I'd ever heard somebody misuse those verses where it says like, I don't want your animal sacrifices. And then they run with that in their mind thinking, oh, God didn't institute this thing. But I think a lot of people go that.
I asked him point blank to the face. I said, well, I know you're, friends with Paul Begley. And I said, I don't trust Paul Begley. And he looked me straight in the eye and he says, I think he's a Jesuit. But then he still hangs out with Paul Begley.
Yeah. Well, they're both had popular channels for a while. I can't remember exactly what Paul Begley got so popular over, but I think, I don't know. People say weird stuff. My friend was just, he lived with me in high school. We took him in because he had like a hard life and he was adopted and all sorts of stuff, and he came to the academy, to the dorm, right, as a dorm student under kind of like a probationary setting because of like they'd send kids to boarding school to the academy kind of thing, right? And if they had been in trouble before, then they'd be on a kind of probation where sort of thing. And he got in a fight with the dean, and then my parents kind of stuck up for him, I guess. And then he lived with us for a while. But I saw him like a year later, and they lived with us again. And then I didn't see him for a long time. And he like basically is like schizophrenic, I guess now it seems like to me. I can't tell for sure, right? And he was trying to convince me, like, he worked for the CIA sort of thing, and I was just like, at first I thought maybe there's something to it or whatever, but then but then he was insane. He was basically schizophrenic, and there's a spectrum there too. And so, people that sin. It's, I think, and I don't mean this to disparage anyone at all either, by the way, but I've heard people like, it's kind of like this, and people even like, they get together and they start talking that way to each other and convincing each other that something's going on. Like they have, like, people are following them, and what do they call that? They call them, like, there's like a name for that. They say that they're like being constantly followed by the FBI, and they're like doing things to them. And I think it's just some sort of psychological thing, and then it gets built upon when, if you don't have the certain kinds of social interactions. And I mean, these people, I mean, I'd hate to say I know for sure what's necessarily happening. I'm sure people have been, pestered in that way by government agencies, and we know that.
I have a funny story. I hope you don't think I'm horrible.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I almost want to burst out laughing when I'm telling you this, because I had this young guy that came up on my doorstep about 5 years ago. He was about 19 years old. He was homeless. He was basically he was an orphan. He was a drug addict. And it was like 12 o'clock at night, and he's pounding on my door. He needed a ride. He didn't know where he was and all this stuff. And I lived in a really bad area. And anyhow, after 3 or 4 years, about 2 or 3 years, actually, I tried to get him into a rehabilitation center. And he stayed with me off and on, and I would throw him out and he'd come back. I'd throw him out and he'd come back. And then he wound up going to prison, and I hadn't seen him for like 6 or 7 months. And he wound up on my doorstep again. And he had to go to his parole officer. This is the most, I hate to tell you, it's hilarious. We were going down Airport Boulevard in Mobile, and I insisted that he was going to go to his parole officer that day, and I was driving him down there. He's like, I want to go to my parole officer. And on the way down the road, he's telling me, he says, I can't even believe my rib collapsed over the other rib. I was laughing so hard I couldn't believe it. He says, he tells me seriously. He would tell me everything about himself, and then he would listen to me. He says, I've been diagnosed that I was schizophrenic. And I'm listening to him, and I'm driving along, and there's traffic along. I turned around, and I looked at him, and I said, do you mean to tell me you're telling me you're nuts?
Oh, dear.
I couldn't believe I said it. And when I realized I said it, I burst out laughing, and I couldn't stop laughing. And he's looking at me out of the corner of his eye, and he's trying to hold his mouth. And he says, he didn't say anything. He was trying not to laugh because I was laughing so hard that I'm looking at him. And he just he's holding it in. And it's like, oh my God, you mean to tell me I'm nuts or what? Oh my God.
Oh, geez.
It was hilarious. He took it so well. It was so funny because he knew me and my personality. Oh God, he went with me all over the place. We traveled, I think, to Pensacola, Gulfport, Gulf Shores. He basically, I wouldn't leave him at my house alone. So when I had to go out and work and I inspected gas stations, I would drag him along with me. So he would use the GPS. But he says, Nancy, he says, you can talk to anybody. He says, you can talk to anybody about anything. And we were really pretty close. I'll never tell him where I live now because he still has this drug problem that I know of. But yeah, it's a challenge. Anyhow, I don't mean to get off.
I feel so. That's how I am with my friend. I can't. I actually moved closer to him. Janet, are you leaving? Is that what you're saying?
No, I was saying I was leaving the site.
Okay,
Just
good. Okay.
Yeah, so Jan. I'll shut up from now on. That story, do you mean to tell me you're nuts? It's just like, oh my God, oh my God, what in the hell did I say to him? He laughed. So it was so humorous. It was so funny. He'll probably never forget it himself.
I was gonna say something about. I tried to talk to Bruce earlier, and he just wasn't having it, and it's like I felt like I couldn't. He didn't get where I was coming from. It was like he was just all he could see was I'm either agreeing with Kenny or I'm agreeing with him, and it wasn't my point at all to agree with either of them. It was to try to clarify a little better. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but so
didn't he try to kick you the other night or whatever? I remember he got mad at you or something.
No, well, wasn't listening to what I was saying. I was like, no, you're not. You're missing my point. I'm not. It's like I felt like he was just seeing it though, and I'm not being all mad. I'm not. This doesn't bug me really. I'm not upset about it or anything. So much as I just want to say what I meant. It was just like, look, I'm saying that like people I keep seeing when he brings it up, a bunch of people start just piling in and saying stuff that's just not true as far as I can tell. Exactly. And they start exaggerating, and that bugs me.
Yeah, I'm glad you spoke up, Jamie. It was time. So yeah, that was good.
Yeah, I'd just be careful about like so look, my understanding about healing and stuff is like this. I think there's people that just dismiss it too quickly. I'm very skeptical about a lot of claims out there, but I know that those kinds of things do happen. At least I'm convinced that they do. I've seen it happen. I know that I felt like I was sincere and wasn't healed for whatever reason, and I'm okay with that. Now, I'm if someone wants to tell me that I wasn't sincere, I mean, it was a serious addiction issue. Like, can God heal that? Absolutely. I know it's possible. Yeah. Could it also be sometimes, like, this is what, and people are going to misunderstand what I'm saying here, but sometimes I think it's possible that it's hard to differentiate between the difference between, you could say like you've been inspired for whatever reason, the circumstances of your life, you've hit rock bottom, whatever it is. And the gospel message hits you in such a way that now, is that the Holy Spirit like doing a miracle? In a sense, it's always a miracle when God moves you enough to turn to him, right? And so it's not exactly easy to explain this. It's like, so sometimes people could just, what makes it a miracle, in other words? If you turn, I think sometimes just that happening, it's not necessarily an instant moment of a miracle where God just instantly removes, say, like your dependency on a drug, which I think that does happen. But sometimes I think just the intensity of the gospel is just you being inspired to do that. And is that the same thing as just an instant miracle? There's not really a line you can differentiate. And some people are just at different places and God calls them at certain times. It's going to look differently. I'm not saying God doesn't do miracles in some sort of like instantaneous thing. It happens. Sometimes he doesn't, and there's probably a reason for it. And maybe the reason for it is because that's the way that's going to help you remain for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, I'm going to say, I don't know. And that people shouldn't assume it doesn't happen certainly is the wrong way to look at it. Right. But I certainly can't get on board with saying you have to have that happen or it's not sincere. I don't believe that. But I don't think people should go around declaring other people's experiences as false, and therefore it's false.
Right.
I don't see him saying that, but they say he does, and I don't see it. I see him saying, look, in this milieu of nominal Christianity, he's operating. This is how I understand it. He's operating with a bunch of people just dismiss, and they want to like act like it doesn't matter that they're not serious about their faith or they're not really sincerely turning to God, and so they need to hear a message that they're not really turning to God in some cases, or that could be the case.
Right. I mean, Jesus was radical. You can't get away from that. Jesus, he promoted a radical change, in our lives, right?
Yeah, exactly. And people forget those, they're so hooked on Paul without looking at what Jesus actually taught, which is a huge mistake. You should be looking at Paul through the eyes of what Jesus taught. And Jesus said stuff like, if you don't lose your life, if you lose your life for me, you'll gain it. If you gain your life, if you gain your life, you'll lose it. Now, that you actually meditate on that. It's very clear that you can't really get out of this one with manipulating what he's saying. You can't just say, oh well, he just means physical life, and then well, no, he says what life are you losing that you gain it? Like this isn't just you can't mess with the definitions on that, you know?
The
Right.
way I look at Paul is that he has a lot of good things to say. Now, everybody realizes that I don't agree with Paul, and I have a lot of disparaging things to say about him. On the other hand, I mean, he does quote some things that are really good. But we have to, my opinion is that if Jesus didn't say it and he told us not to do it, then don't do it. There's just a whole lot out there that we need to pay attention to. Our life, I mean, I look at the fact that right now we are in the very end times, and I can't even deny. Maybe it'll happen in my lifetime. I think it will because, as a child, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I was raised, I knew that the end of the world was going to come in my lifetime. I might be very well wrong. I might die, but everything in the book of Revelation, as I can see it, is adding up right now to the point where we are looking at a society where we are not going to be able to buy, sell, or trade without the mark of the beast, because this is all it's all being employed through all of these, unique little ways of doing it with world society and the, one world government and Klaus Schwab and the, the shot and everything else that's going on, that things are getting pretty radical out there. And it's going to come to a point in time that if we don't comply with all of the rules of society, we are not going to be able to buy, sell, or trade. Are we able to provide? Are we prepared for this right now? This is my big thing. I mean, I might talk about a lot of other things along the sidelines, but this is my big thing. Prepare yourself, because we aren't going to have financial ability to do anything if we don't provide some way or a means for ourselves to sustain ourselves.
Can I read a verse, Jamie?
Yeah,
that?
and maybe I can sell those 5-gallon things of beans and stuff and make some money, huh? What do you think? No, you can be my.
You could try. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Second Peter, it says, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also, and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Now, this is the main point. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness? So that's our walk, looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God. So, I mean, that's one thing about, there's a lot of people in all these different doctrines that talk about being in the last days. And some of them you'll hear about physical prep, but that's talking about a spiritual prep, that when we see these things happening, we ought to be more concerned about walking in holiness and godliness.
Yeah, I know, right? Yep. Yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Those,
one more. It's
yeah.
I
Yes.
cut this off. It says, wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent that you may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless. Woo! So that's good.
Oh dear heavens, that can't be.
Blameless. Woo!
Yeah, blameless even, like John the Baptist's parents and stuff,
Right.
or whatever,
Righteous like Job.
Like Job, like Noah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think all that's just for believe OSAS is what I heard. I don't know. You interpret it. You have to reinterpret the words. That's what it really means. So what
But
do
we
you?
can forget all that. Forget all that, and we'll just buy the beans.
Yeah, just get the sauce. Order the sauce. I got a case from Costco the other day. It'll work. No, I'm just kidding. Do y'all think that what is, let's see. I think people like to say conversion and being born again, all those kinds of terms, right? Like, or they just think it means believe the right doctrine. And is what's funny about that, it hits me sometimes when I hear people talking. And I think Paul kind of hints at this in Romans, even like the first chapter of Romans is like being I don't even know for sure how to interpret that verse, exactly what he's saying. So I want to say that up front. But like when it talks about the Gentiles who are like, when they don't know, not knowing the law, they're a law unto themselves. Like, I don't know if that's talking about them knowing the law, what's right and what's wrong, or if it's talking about something else. But I've often wondered if it's like, it seems like you're going to have your own rules. If you don't follow God's rules, you're going to put something has to go there, it seems to me. And everybody seems to do that. It's just like, I just see people saying like, oh, well, we're going to have to do that law thing. And then I hear Baptists talking to each other and they'll say like, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. It's just weird. It's, but we're all guilty at times, I think.
What was the question?
It just is version. What does that mean?
You don't
What is
probably you probably don't want to hear what I have to say, Jamie, but
I don't care.
there's a lot of you might care. There's a lot of division that goes on in this world right now within Christianity that basically is all created by Pauline doctrine. And I'm not saying I don't know where he stands actually with, the grace of God or whatever, but we have 40,000 or more denominations of Christianity across the world, and they are all split between doctrines that are created because of Catholicism, which was focused on Pauline. I'm not, it's like you have a doctrine. Janet has a doctrine. I have a belief. I don't know if either of you have doctrines, but I have a belief too. And if we go and we look at what Jesus said, Jesus' words only, and we believe what he said, and if they do not apply to what Paul, says, who do we believe? It's like this grace doctrine, once saved, only saved, and everything like that. It's like Jesus clearly told us we can fall away from salvation if we don't do certain things. How do you deny it?
But Paul says that too.
He says it. He does say that. I agree with you 100%. He says that. But then he turns around in other gospels and he says something completely 180 degrees opposite of it and tells us that the law is a curse. How can you be both? That blows my mind.
Well, there's a couple options there, I think there's a couple options, and this is where people
probably not a good place to discuss it right now, maybe. I don't know, but I just like totally, wait a minute. I believe what Jesus said. If Jesus didn't say it, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to believe it.
Did Jesus know he was going to be the sacrifice for sins? Yes or no?
I believe yes, 100%.
Okay, yeah, I figured you could say that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's like he knew he was going. It wasn't like God said, well, Jesus, God didn't say anything. Jesus talked. Do
you believe that God's plan all along, that God knew Jesus was going to be the sacrifice for sin? Do you believe that?
Yeah, it says it in John 1.
Yeah, right. But, you can kind of see it in the Old Testament, right? Like you see the types and shadows that, don't you?
Well, it's like, if you have, I don't understand.
I'm not trying to lead you along.
understand.
I guess I'm trying to just understand like
I'm
where you're coming from.
Okay, I have no comprehension of the Trinity. It was not something that I ever understood, learned, or whatever. I'm like looking at it and going, what the hell is this Trinity? I mean, it's like, and John explains it in John 1. Jesus was there. He was the I am. He came and he was the one that created all things. God, he was the first and only begotten Son of the Father. And, it's like he was there from the beginning, but he was with God from the beginning. And it's like Adam and Eve, for crying out loud, in the Garden of Eden. It's like they were one flesh. Eve was within Adam from the time that God created him. And all he did was make her come out of his rib. And that's the same thing with Jesus. That's the way I look at it, as the fact that, from the beginning of the earth and the world, that Jesus was within God. And then basically, and it goes on in John, and says, if you believe in me and keep my commandments, my Father and I will come and make our abode within you.
That's what I'm reading right now in John 14.
Yeah, Jesus dwells in the bosom of the Father. Now, if he dwells in the bosom of the Father, where does Jesus dwell with us? We are his rib. The bride of Christ is his rib. We are Eve. And that's the way I see it.
Yeah,
I mean, I
see that too.
And
in a metaphorical sense, we're the bride of Christ. It's all pictured in the Genesis account.
Yeah,
in kind of an interesting way.
When the final return of Jesus comes, he is calling his people, Israel, all to him. We are his bride, and I don't believe we're Gentiles. Those, he says, my sheep hear my voice. So how do you know if you're a Gentile or an Israelite? Because Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. So you've got to be of Israel somewhere, however, through all the generations that, back 2,000 years or whatever, before whatever. My sheep hear my voice. If you're not a sheep of God, you're not going to hear his voice. If you're not a sheep of Jesus, you're not going to hear his voice. You're not going to be one of his fold. And basically, the way I look at it is that, okay, so now we come down to the final thing, is that Jesus he is the Son of God. He has a wife. His wife is part of him. They're one flesh. So it's inevitable that when the final consummation comes with his second coming, that we will become his bride. But we have to be washed perfectly clean, because you cannot have sin that is within the body of Christ. If there is any sin, we cannot be inheritors yoked with Jesus to be sons of God and in the kingdom. We have to be washed clean. I mean, that's my understanding and ideology, is that we are supposed to be 100% pure, and Jesus will do that with us. And if we're chastised, we have to wipe that sin out of our life. We can't just be whitewashing it. It has to be gone, refined as pure gold. What did Jesus say? It's like, can you, how did he put this? He said, can you withstand, or can you handle the cup that I have, gone through? I mean, his cup was horrible. We have to be able to go through being refined as pure gold. And sometimes that means hell on earth for us, that we are going to absolutely go through every tragedy, whether we like it or not. And I know I've gone through it. I lost 2 children through one way or another. I can't even, I don't want to go there right now and explain it all. But I mean, it's like, and then God brings us back, and then he gives us the desires of our heart, and he protects us. And the Sabbath is a blessing. It's something that if we are not covered by the Sabbath as a sign between God and us throughout our generations for eternity, and it's like, okay, when we keep the Sabbath, he gives us a covering, just like he gave us a covering when it came to the Passover lamb, his blood. So how can we expect possibly that as a, I don't mean to insult anybody, if we want to claim to be a Gentile, the Gentiles in the Old Testament were not allowed to participate in the Passover unless they were circumcised. That's a flat out rule. And so if you want to be a Gentile right now in this creation or this new covenant, you better damn well be circumcised. Now, I don't, people condemn me. Oh, how can you be circumcised? An answer for that, but I think it's like built in somehow. But you can't keep Jesus' blood and sacrifice without, and have that protection without, submitting to him and doing his commandments. Anyhow, I'm off my soapbox.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say this. I don't think you have to be physically circumcised, but you have to be circumcised of the heart. And so the signs of the covenant, I think, obviously, I think why wouldn't we keep the Sabbath still? But then so the nuances are like when you get into, I got to do a study on this and then do a teaching on it, I think, because I kind of like take for granted that people see certain concepts and maybe they don't. And I think it helps clear up a lot of stuff. Like the reason for me that I could just never let go of Paul is because when you see the teachings of the book of Hebrews and what it's saying, and it's not just all a bunch of metaphors, it's actually talking about something that was part of God's plan from the beginning. And this is so cool. I don't know yet. Go ahead.
Excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
According to about the majority of scholars, they do not think that Paul wrote Hebrews. And there's no reason to believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. It was a book that was written, and it was and there's only 7 epistles of Paul that people believe that are actually written by Hebrews because of the linguistic, evaluation of it to suggest that they were actually his works. I'll finish it.
Well, I would say this. One of the problems I think why people don't, whether it's Paul or not, is that it actually doesn't really matter. It's the theology in there and how to understand the theology, because everybody can see certain things lined up. But for instance, like in Colossians 2, if you actually dissect carefully what's being said there, people take that as like Jesus nailing the law to the cross. Nobody ever thought that. Nobody ever thought he nailed the whole law to the cross. And then it seems like I want to hear from people, it's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. No, it isn't. What do you mean all or nothing? Like there is aspects of the law, to me, I would say, that where, I'm sorry, you can't keep the feasts as dictated in the law. It's not possible. And so, like, because the rule is you have to be in Jerusalem on certain occasions. The rule is that the new moon is sighted from Jerusalem, which tells you right that it can't be intended for the entire world in the same way other things can be, because it was associated with the land, for one, is associated with the moon from a certain place, and also the Hebrew calendar was never given to the entire world. This is another big one. Therefore, there's no record or attempt of early Christians like making sure that they taught the churches, the Hebrew calendar, so that they had to keep, because God expected them to keep the holidays. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. It didn't happen, and it doesn't make sense. And then if you understand Paul correctly, he does certain things about the law don't matter anymore. When you look at Colossians 2, he's talking about the festivals. Why is he talking about the festival? I think this really is the answer that makes sense. And then this clarifies, he's not talking about everything about God's law. He's talking about more in the aspect of the covenant, which if you actually carefully look at it, okay, look, God. So in other words, what he's nailing to the cross is, what is the cross? It's of Jesus. What are the ordinances and I'm not saying this is a strict, it's always ordinances. I mean, the word commandment, ordinance, and statutes and stuff can be kind of intermixed and interused with each other to refer to certain aspects. But the idea, if you understand the concepts here, this makes so much sense, especially with Daniel 9. Jesus put the sacrifices and oblations to cease. The word oblations is tied to the grain and cereal offerings. Why is that word used? Because if you look it up in several translations, it's very much associated in the other verses that use it. It says in Leviticus 23 that the day after the Sabbath is when they do the wave sheaf offering. Why do you think 1 Corinthians 15 says he's the first fruits of them that slept? And I believe he did right. This is the reason why I actually think for certain, and it's pretty much straightforward in the Gospels, that he rose on the first day of the week. Okay, this the dark portion right before the day dawned. I know people have argued it.
Would you say that again about First Corinthians? I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. I was
1 Corinthians 15. You just in passing it, and then there's other places too. I'm trying to remember the other verse, but yeah, it uses the wave sheaf offering language, the grain offering from the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and when they would wave the sheaf or whatever. It says in Leviticus 23 they do that on the first day after the Sabbath. And Jesus rises on that day, and he's called the first fruits. That is when of them that slept. So he is the grain offering. The grain offering he put the sacrifice and oblation. The word oblation in the Hebrew is related to the grain offerings. So what I'm saying is, because the feasts are types of Jesus' ministry and what he would accomplish and be the sacrifice. And then why is that?
That's absolutely true, Jamie. And I will emphasize even more that Jesus, on the day that he died and he was on the cross, he represented the first of the first fruits, and he represented the wave sheaf, because the children of Israel could not go and partake of the new grain of the field. I mean, okay, they started this barley harvest with the first of the first fruits. That grain was not ripe. It wasn't ripe at all. It was just the green little, nubs of barley. And basically they could start going out and gleaning that. However, listen to me. I'm thinking I'm typing these words, for crying out loud. I'm stupid. But they went out there and they partook of this grain, and they gathered it. And it was just the first little green, ripe grains of food. But they could not eat or partake of it until the morrow after the Sabbath of the Passover. And basically, that represented Jesus Christ. And when he hung on that cross, Jesus represented the first of the first fruits of the grain that was waved before God before they could partake of that barley harvest. So when Jesus was on that cross, he was the first of the first fruits that was waved before God. Now, does this make sense to you?
This is undeniable, because that's why he says he's the first for them that slept. The first fruits, meaning that wave sheaf offering happened on Sunday of Passover, which is he's the Passover lamb. This is undeniable.
Right.
And
he was the
wave to God. He's the down payment that would raise the rest of God's people, those that are his, that is coming.
And that particular day was a high Sabbath. the morrow after the Passover was when the first fruits were waved before God. And then they counted 49 weeks to Pentecost. And so during that period of time, they crossed. Okay. Another thing is they crossed over the Jordan River. And that was also a Passover. They crossed over the Jordan River, and then they could partake. It talks about it in not Jacob, Joseph. Oh God, who came after Moses?
Joseph?
No,
Joshua.
not Joseph. Joshua. Okay, when they came across the Jordan River, they had gone around the city of Jericho for 7 days, and they were carrying the ark. But then they crossed over the Jordan River, and the very same day over, they ate of the old and the new grain of the same day. It was a Passover because they ate of the old and they ate of the new. Okay, when Jesus, died on the cross, it's the same thing. We partake of the old grain and the new grain the day that he died. And that was the wave sheaf offering. And then, it goes on. It's like, 49, 40, well, not 49, 49. I mean, we have our Jubilee years. So anyhow, Jesus represented that grain sheaf offering, wave sheaf offering. And then we go into the book of Revelation, and it's like it all throughout. And then he also, I'm sorry, I'm retracting again. We look into the where Jesus was teaching, and he was out in the wilderness, and he had 5,000 people or whatever. And he basically had a few fish and a few barley loaves. Now, during the time of that situation where, between the wave sheaf and whatever, it was probably the Feast of Weeks, or not Feast of Weeks, but the Feast of Passover, where they couldn't eat unleavened bread. And he had all these people out there. There were 5,000 of them. And they had unleavened loaves of barley. And he, when it came to the point that, he wanted, the people were to disperse, he's like, no, we're going to go and feed all these people. So he had 5,000 people there and all of these loaves of barley. So he does this miracle, and he, has the fish and the barley or whatever. They were unleavened. That means that was a group of people that were within his covenant, in my opinion. Okay. And I mean, it's like he multiplied those loaves, and there wasn't just 5,000 people there. There were women and children. Okay. So it's like, when we look at the book of Revelation, then we can say, wait, these are his chosen people. These are those that are without blemish or whatever. And then we go to the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost again. Now he's got 4,000 people and a few fish and a few loaves, but he doesn't say they're unleavened loaves of barley. He talks about the fact that there were 4,000 people. In the first thing about the barley loaves and the 5,000 people, there were 12 baskets, and there was leftover loaves, and they were taken up or whatever. I don't remember, but there was 5,000 people and 12 baskets. That means the 12 tribes. The second revelation here is that, okay, now we have 4,000 people and 7 loaves, and there was an abundance taken up, and that they, it was like they couldn't, the 7 loaves were taken up into heaven. But, if we remember and think back at the early Passover, if there was anything left over, they couldn't leave anything left over. So there's a disparity between the 5,000 people and the 4,000 people. The second group of people, in my opinion and thought, is the church. The first 1,000 are Israel. I mean, it's like a needle in a haystack here, but there's a huge disparity when it comes to that teaching. What does this mean? Does that make any sense, Jamie?
Yeah, I'll have to look at that, see what you're saying more. But I think I think a lot of stuff in Scripture is like that. Because that's what happens. Everything in the Old Testament seems to have applications like that. That's actually predictive, and a lot of people don't accept that. I know that, but I'll have to look at that one. Where that would be like the other time he's feeding a crowd or something. I don't remember that one. I hear what you're. The concept makes sense.
So it's a very detailed thing that I'm discussing. It's not like, and then you go into Revelation. He says, when you come into the seals of the horsemen, it's okay. We have another problem in the black horse or whatever. Do not harm the oil and the wine. I think basically all of Revelation has to discuss is it's the harvests of the people of Israel that come through different types of harvests. The first is, Jesus is the first fruit. Then, the 144,000, and then your final harvest is like, the multitudes that stand on a glass that sing a song of Moses that no man can sing. And it says, and don't harm the oil and the wine, in one of the prophecies there. I think the oil and the wine are representative of don't harm the barley, the people that are Jesus' first fruits, because there's going to be an anointing upon the 144,000, and don't harm the wine because they are his final harvest. The wine comes at the very end of the harvest. It's like you crush the grapes.
Yeah, right. It's the marriage supper of the lamb, the grape juice or the wine or whatever. You got there's definitely something to that for sure. I think but the harvest, if you're actually paying attention to all the things said about grain, people are likened to grain as among other metaphors. But like when you actually look at all the places we're talking, like just the other day, someone was reading, it was CJ, I think, and he was reading a passage from Genesis 25, maybe where Abraham's talking to Isaac, or maybe it's Isaac talking to Jacob and Esau, and like Jacob's blind or Isaac's blind, and he tells Jacob that he can smell that it's him or something, and he tells him he smells like a sweet spring field of grain or whatever, something like that, or a field of grass or whatever. And this is the father of the 12 tribes. And even, I can think of a million metaphors where this is implied when Jesus is, or how about like the fact that on the third day, the dry land appears and then the grass sprouts up, it says in the Genesis story. And like, that sounds a lot to me like God making a path in the sea for the Israelites during the third millennium. And then the idea that the seed is just sprouting up, out on the newly formed ground is like God calling his people, making a covenant with them that would forth the Messiah. So it's like the beginning of God taking them by the hand out of Egypt and teaching his people to bring forth the Messiah. And then, so that makes sense to me. And then the grass thing is like, in Genesis, it says there was no man to till the wild grass. And then, Mary sees Jesus resurrected, and when she's coming to the tomb, this lone woman, right? And it says, I think it's in John, the only place it says this, but that she mistaken him for the gardener, so she sees Jesus, but she thinks it's just the gardener, and that's one of the reasons people think he's raised at the garden tomb, right? And but I see that as like one that tills the wild grass, the one who's going to harvest the grass at the end of the age, the one that said, let the seed grow up together and don't pluck them out until the end, let them grow up together. And then when they ask him about the bad seed, he says, well, an enemy has done this. And, he's coming with a sickle in his mouth to harvest the earth. When the Son of Man comes, he'll send forth his angels and they'll gather up the bundles to be burned in the barn. And, all the metaphors of grass are clearly him talking about, he's growing a field. He's growing a field. And it's all over Scripture. It's not a coincidence. It's not just, it's a nice metaphor, so I'll randomly use it. No, it's all about what it's, and you can piece carefully and not take it too far, obviously, I think. But there's a lot of things to be gleaned from that. And, it's never a coincidence, or it's never random when certain metaphors are used. I think you just got to be careful with what it means necessarily, I think. So, but yeah, the whole bread thing is definitely something going on there. I think, what was I going to say? Oh, regarding the feast though, I wanted to say one more thing about it. And then I'll give you guys you gals the last word here, because I'm really tired. But if you don't understand that all the festivals were, so I'm going to say it like this. Let me just give a quick narrative. As soon as Adam and Eve sin, and they're going away from God, they've disobeyed, they didn't put their faith in God and trust Him, and this whole time He's calling them back to Himself. It's not just about Israel. This is where people get all mixed up. If you look at the whole narrative, as soon as they sin, we see animal sacrifices implemented. He put skins on them, and they tried to cut with the leaves, and He said no, and then He makes them skins. Cain and Abel, He tells Cain and Abel to do a certain kind of sacrifice is implied. And of course, Abel's all irritated. Cain was all irritated because God didn't accept his sacrifice, but He didn't provide the first of his flock like Abel did. And, Cain got all upset about it. And you can make that apply to potentially to, end time issues between people. He's like, isn't this good enough? I brought this thing to you. And God's like, no, I said, and then Abel did what he said, but then Cain murders his brother. It says, even regarding persecution in the last days, it says they'll kill you thinking they do God a favor. The Antichrist is going to, the final Antichrist before Christ destroys him, is going to, in my opinion, from Scripture anyway, is going to be saying he's of God. That's why it's a whore, because it's a false church, so to speak. There's different ways to understand that. But the whole point is, this symbology has a purpose. In other words, I'll get back on track with what I was saying. The idea would be God provides, and He does it so with the animal sacrificial system, right? Noah's sacrifice, after Cain and Abel, we see that's going on. He's trying to teach them something. And then we see Noah clean animals, and then he does sacrifices. We know they're doing sacrifices, right? And then when he calls Israel, Moses wants to take them out to do sacrifices to Yahweh, and Pharaoh won't let them, right? Then when he gets them out of there, they're doing sacrifices to Yahweh. And then he starts implementing the priesthood with the covenant. And they have a temporary tabernacle made after the one in heaven. So God's using His people. They're going to take the land, and then they're going to establish a physical temple, a permanent temple. And it's got a bunch of rules and regulations. But all that, and he appoints the people, right, the tribes and the priesthood, the Levites, to do the rituals for the sins of the people. That all represents something. It's not just some weird ritualistic thing. It's a purposeful thing that God started teaching them from the beginning, and then He establishes a priesthood to cement it in. But He's saying, you got to do this. And then, think about the story with Abraham. God will provide the lamb. You think that's a coincidence? Do you think they just made? Do you think that's not a real story? If you believe in Jesus, that happened for a reason. God stopped Him. I'll provide. The firstborn were killed in Egypt, the Passover, if they didn't put the blood on the doorway. All this stuff is pointing to Christ. All of it. Every little bit of it. So what was God's intention? Is where people get confused, is thinking Israel's kind of weird and special and God's going to give them different rules. No. he's using them to bring forth the Messiah, to implement the fullness of his plan, to call all the nations of the earth back to him, Messiah. So people get all caught up with this. No, they were an example for us to recognize Christ and what God's trying to do, call us back to him from the very, very beginning. And all that stuff was to point to the Messiah when he came. All these stories, all these things that happened. So all these festivals occurred so that when Christ came in his ministry, he fulfills all these things on the days, and all those days were types of what he would do and what he is doing now and what we wait for him to do. So it doesn't have to be confusing. When Paul's talking to me, Paul's saying, look, this is the fullness of what God was saying he's going to do the whole time, with Christ being a sacrifice, with the things in the events that occurred, which would type what Christ did during his ministry. And so people need to get that straight in their heads. There's not going to be a temple where he brings back animal sacrifices. Not that now that Jesus has come, we should be seeing everything through that lens. That's Christos-centered. God loves the world, is calling everybody back to himself through what Jesus would do. There's no for these guys. There's not, he doesn't care about Israel, not about the Gentiles in the same way. No, he cares about them because Messiah would come so he could call back the nations, every tribe, tongue, and nation. So when Paul talks about nailing stuff to the cross, he's talking about that the fullness of those things that were types of Jesus is here now. So he's not saying he's nailing his moral, attributes that tell us how to be to the cross to do away with them. No, he's saying the things added because of sins. What's added because of sins is the sacrifices for sins until the Messiah would come, until the time of Reformation. And that time has come. So Paul's not poo-pooing the entire law. He's poo-pooing the part of the covenant that Jesus until he came. And he's saying the promises to Abraham are here. So it's like, once you understand this and see this for its fullness and beauty, it all starts to fall into place. Paul's not saying God's moral commands are done away with. He's saying the aspects of the covenant that were added for sins until the time of Reformation, that's nailed to the cross. Not because, and I don't even think Paul was saying it was bad. It's just saying you can't deny the Messiah now that he's here and go back to these other things that we used to do, which were all, their whole purpose was so you'd recognize the Messiah. And so, then if you understand this book of Hebrews slowly, you'll never go back to any other way of looking at it, because it's what it's teaching. So anyways, I'm done. If you guys want to comment, whatever you want to comment, I thank you so much for coming. Thanks for letting me chat you. I just feel really passionate about that. And love you guys both.
Okay, Jamie, I only have a couple questions because I'm getting tired and I'm going to go fall asleep any minute. Okay. I mentioned this in a message to you in just a couple of minutes ago. Why would Paul call the law a curse? And in opposition, why would Jesus say, I came to uphold the law? And basically anyone that says that the law is done away with would basically, how does he say? I've not come to take away the law, but to uphold the law. And anyone that takes away from the law will be considered least in the kingdom of heaven. And those that teach the law will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Can you please explain that to me?
I think Paul was talking to a bunch of legalists who had no idea what he meant when he said that there would, or even when it was foretold in Jeremiah about, the law, instead of written on stone and written on our heart. And they were so married to their tradition and to legalism that he wanted to be stark with them to get through to them, because his walk
I referenced question. I'm sorry, Janet. I referenced the question to Jamie specifically.
Yeah, he wasn't answering. That's why I thought maybe he left.
No, I agree with what Janet said. That's what I was kind of trying to say.
I would like to hear
You
what
can't think of it as
you say. I would like to hear what
the
you have
entire
to
law.
say, Jamie.
I would say he's saying, I would agree with what Janet said, and then I would also add that there is a sense that Jesus was going to fulfill, in the sense that he's doing away with it in this one sense, that you no longer have to do animal sacrifices, and that's what Colossians means. He's saying the things that we were having to do with the priesthood, with the temple and the sacrificial system, Jesus did away with that. And so that's what he nailed to the cross, because his body was nailed to the cross, and his body is the sacrifice. That's once for all. And so but that includes repentance. And then the last thing is that the law that Paul's talking about is also that he's looking at, like, these people are rejecting the Messiah and thinking they're right with God without the atoning sacrifice of the Messiah. So if you in the law is a ministry of death, and is what he says is, because if you're not forgiven, guilty of death for breaking it. So he's saying it was a ministry of death. They had to keep doing sacrifices to tide God over it, so to speak, right? To do away with their sins, but then that wouldn't do away with their sins. They'd keep sinning. Then they'd have to do sacrifices the next year or whatever, however you want to say it. And so he's saying, look, that's the ministry of death, because you keep sinning, and sin brings death because you're worthy of death for being a sinner. That's what he's saying. That's how it's a ministry of death. It wouldn't take away their sin.
I hear you, JB, but you're pushing Jesus into a corner. What did Jesus say? What did he possibly say about, the law? I'm baffled, because when people try to go and say, okay, this is what it means, they quote Paul and override what Jesus said. What did Jesus say about the same subject?
He said, no jot or tittle would pass away. And this is why I exist, Nancy, to help people get this straight. I mean, I'm not saying I have every detail figured out, but I'm saying he's talking there. There is a sense that you have to make partitions in the law, because God doesn't. Jesus represents what those other things represent. So, like, yes, when they did animal sacrifices, God didn't just want a ritual. He wanted people that understood, you have to trust me. I told you need to do a sacrifice. That means you have to give up the best, the firstborn and the flawless, animal you have. And you have to give that up to me in repentant trust that I'm going to do away with your sin. I'm going to heal you. And so you're listening to God. You're looking to him in repentance, in recognition of your sin, the thing he implemented. And then that ultimately is pointing to what Christ does. So Jesus isn't sacrifices after he dies. He's not teaching like every little thing, it's all or nothing. I don't believe. I reject that. The temple's destroyed for a reason.
We recognize that animal sacrifices are no longer required, but the law has not been done away with. Are you going to contradict Jesus?
No, because I agree the law's not done away with. I don't think Paul was saying everything about the law was done away with. He was saying it can't save you, and it can't.
You're not recognizing what Paul says, because he says the law is a curse. Did Jesus say the law was a curse? ? I mean, I don't know how to explain it better than that. Where did Jesus say that the law was a curse?
He didn't.
But you and everyone else that is against Paul, you're looking at like 3 sentences that Paul said and ignoring the other thousands and thousands of things that Paul said that did support what Jesus said and are all about living solely for the glory of God.
Paul said things, Janet. I'm not talking directly against you. Paul said many things throughout the New Testament that go back and forth and back and forth. He supports the law, he hates the law. He says this, he says that. I mean, it's like it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I mean, anybody that Okay, if I was an unbeliever, which I was a believer for like 40, 50, 60 years, and I looked at it and I'm like, okay, this is what Paul said. But at the other, I mean, he'll go on for 2 or 3 or 4 scriptures or 5 chapters or whatever he does, and then at the end of it, he's like attests the law, and then he condemns the law. It's like, what the hell? Is he schizophrenic or delusional or what? I mean,
Well, I don't
it's
know.
like,
It's the way that different people read and understand, but I've never read anything in his writings that where I've had the attitude, oh, I can just sort of relax here and not worry about the instructions. I've never felt that.
you are relaxing his instructions as I speak right now, and so is Jamie. I mean, it's like look at what the hell is Ace Theo all about? He promotes every detail about Paul. I mean, every single damn detail. He's like, oh, he quotes Paul. Okay, fine. And we all know that his theology is worthless. And he's like, and then he comes up with once saved, always saved, because grace is the whole thing. It's like, where does this come from? It comes from nowhere other than Paul. And oh God, I don't mean, I didn't intend for this to come tonight to discuss this, because I respect Jamie and I respect you, Janet, but the reality of it all is that the Christian church has been divided 100% because of the teachings of Paul. And that's the final conclusion. If we believed in the teachings of Jesus, we wouldn't be having this discussion and argument right now. And
well,
that's
I've never read like in John or Matthew and then read in Galatians and felt bipolar. That's the only thing I know. It seems like if there was this gross contradiction, that there would be some, some check in my spirit. I guess I trust the Spirit. I trust Holy Spirit. I guess that's,
And I think a lot of the historically, even though the church was splitting before and there's issues, and the Catholic Church got way off the rails where they don't even really care what the Bible's teaching anymore, it seems to me, making up their own stuff or whatever. When you read the early church fathers carefully, they don't keep the commandments. Even the reformers didn't say that. They made distinctions, and nowadays people want to say those distinctions aren't appropriate. And I kind of bought into that for a little bit, and because I wanted to be careful. But then, just going back to what I was actually taught originally, actually is really I don't see a better answer. I mean, there are distinctions, there has to be, and when you actually look at the narrative carefully, it's like, yeah, well, there's the moral attributes of God, which are just like obviously non-negotiable. Like he's going to do away with basic morality. That's just insane. But it was codified in the commandments. There's other ways to establish these. And Paul even says things were added because of the sin. It means the sacrifices. It was like there's a sense where it was like God's way of keeping you from going totally off the rails until Christ would come, and then that's the fullness of the whole plan. But the problem is people that now teach that Jesus doesn't actually take away your sins. In reality, they just say it's magic, or it's just like legal declarations, but no real power, which is wrong. But nobody ever taught this stuff. That's confused everybody at this point. It almost seems like, at least the reformers weren't saying like the law is done away with, like people say now. They all understood like that doesn't make any sense. They actually translated the Bible and understood it. They got things, I would say, but like it's like a slow move towards the truth until Christ comes. As far as that's my opinion anyway. And so it's obvious if you just think about it for a second. It's obvious. Like if God wanted us to have the temple and to do sacrifices, you're only going to think that if you don't understand what was going on, with the whole point until Christ would come at the fullness of time for the time of Reformation and bring the real power to obey God. Just so many people deny it, the power of God. And when you see that's what he's doing, that's what Paul's saying. He's saying that he's dealing with people who are during the switch of the covenants who aren't accepting the Messiah. And they're think about being an Israelite, and then all of a sudden it's gone, and what you've always done for sin is done. It's done. And it's like, we're the people of God, and you're saying like this guy died. What are you talking about? The Messiah is going to be the king of Israel. And so they're confused, and he's trying to convince these people that no, if you're rejecting Messiah, you're screwed. You're not the law. So in that sense, the law is a minister of death. It is a minister of death because when you sin, you're worthy of death. That is a ministry of death. It can't save you by itself.
Jamie, I am being very sweet to you right now, because I would literally bury you with your conversation. At what point, I mean, we live in a world right now which is completely delusional. I don't know what your thoughts are on Christmas and Easter, but the majority of those that keep the feast days and the commandments and the holy and the Sabbath days will not condone Christmas or Easter. What are your opinions about Christmas and Easter? Because it's one thing. We can't be of both minds, period.
Nancy, let me take 2 minutes to say my final, because I need to go. And I think, but Jamie answers.
Yeah, I'm really tired too. Let's continue this, because I'm totally out of it. I'll give you my thoughts on it. You might be surprised, but
if I could just real quick.
Yeah, let Janet go. Because I just want to say goodbye. I
want to close with a little bit of unity, because for people that don't know, Nancy and I are friends, and we don't fight over this because basically we chose not to talk about it. I mean, we know that we're not going to convince each other. I mean, we disagree, and there's other things that we really agree a lot on, and so that's that. But anyway, when people see us as the James gang and the legalists and on, and the things that I think we are grossly misrepresented on is that I'm always hearing that we don't think we sin, and we think we do it all right, and we're righteous, and we're always keeping the law, whatever. And I know Jamie and I know Nancy, and we all share our failures. We're well aware every single day of our failures. And thank God that in 1 John, when we sin, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And just because we don't talk about it a lot online doesn't mean that we don't appreciate grace. I mean, thank God for grace, because I need it every day when I get up in the morning and start thinking and talking. I need grace. I need his mercy, and I need his forgiveness. And so just because it's not our emphasis here on YouTube does not mean that we don't understand it and that we don't appreciate and aren't aware of our own daily failures. So, and I thank you, Jamie, for allowing us to come on and share. And I love you too. And you too, Nancy.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you. Good night, y'all. I'm going to say one last thing, Nancy. You can if you want.
And
maybe email me, and we can. Janet, you have to come back and do this with me more often, regularly too. So
yeah, this kind of
night, right?
Yeah, in the
okay,
late
good.
At night.
I sent you an email, so you look for that, and I'm paying attention more. I'm getting back on track there. So
okay, great.
So get a hold of me. And we'll plan a time. Go ahead,
Jamie. I don't have your email, so maybe if Janet has it, she can email it.
Yeah, give it to me. Yeah, can you get it from there? Can you get it from her?
Yeah, as soon as we enter, I'll do that.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna play the rest of that video. I'm gonna let that rest of that video play while I lay down. So
I'm I'm going to sleep, so thank you, Jamie, for letting me be included. And I love the friends in the side chat. And sorry I didn't answer and respond to all the questions. And anyhow, have a good evening and shalom.
Hey guys, see everybody. If you want to stay and watch this thing it's Bart Ehrman. He's going to talk about the law and the new covenant and Christianity. If you missed part of this, it's really Ebionites and I put the link in the description. So if you want to watch the whole video, I didn't start it at the very beginning. It's mainly just some nothing about the scholarship, but just kind of interesting things he had to say about his that are funny, actually. I think I don't endorse Bart Ehrman. Obviously he's not a believer, but he's not a bad scholar. He's a great scholar. You just got to know where he's coming from. Doesn't mean I agree with all his scholarship either. I certainly don't, because I believe the text is right. But he points out a lot of things because he studied on the early church to some degree, and he studied Jesus and the period and all that. So don't misunderstand like I'm promoting everything he teaches or writes about. So if you ever have any questions about anything I play, I don't always just play what I think is exactly right. I don't just play the stuff from my church. I play things for different reasons. If you're ever confused about it, don't be afraid to comment or ask questions. Never be afraid to ask me questions. And always know when I do open chats, I would love to hear from you, whether you agree or disagree. And I want to encourage you to step out on a limb, even if you feel uncomfortable joining something like a chat room where people are watching and listening. It might help you grow as a person, and do something hard every day to help you grow socially and just as a person. So no pressure, but I want to encourage you, and if you're nervous, I'll pick up on it, and we'll make sure you're not mistreated. And so I really want to encourage different people, no matter what, even if you totally disagree with me and you think I'm a heretic, I want to encourage you to do it, as long as you don't act totally out of line or something. I'm going to be nice to you. So I want to encourage you to do that. And I'm going to keep encouraging people to do it, to help people, grow socially or whatever, to grow theologically, spiritually, if I can help them do that at all. So you're always welcome to join when I have open streams, and I want to encourage you to do it. So thanks for coming. I appreciate you guys a lot.
Creation in the book of Genesis, where God creates the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rests, thereby sanctifying the seventh day. Jews have misunderstood that to think that it means that they themselves are not supposed to work on the seventh day, and that's not what it means at all. What's going on is this. In the Bible, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. When the Bible says that God created...
Just really quick, if you didn't see where the context here is, he's describing some nutty views, in other words, of interpretations that some of the early church fathers had said, some of them. And so he's talking about, I believe it was Barnabas, which is not a very good thing to look to theologically, right? It was considered an early church writing, although that's disputed. It truly was, and how much it's been possibly modified or tampered with in some cases. And so this is right in the middle of him saying some of these weird interpretations that these people had, like Barnabas, I believe, is in view here. So just keep that in mind. I certainly don't endorse this whatsoever, what he's talking about right here.
The world in 6 days, it means that creation is going to last 6,000 years. The day of rest is the millennium that's coming, the 1,000-year period of peace that's going to come to earth. It's not talking about what you're supposed to do on Saturday. It's talking about what's going to happen in our future when the end comes. Barnabas is the first one that I know of who indicates that the world's going to last 6,000 years. You may remember this was kind of a big deal back in the year 2000 when people thought, well, this is it, because fundamentalists thought the world was created 4,000 BC, and now it's 2,000, that's 6,000, this is it. Well, that Barnabas is the first one to come up with that particular bit of reasoning. You can imagine this kind of reasoning wasn't all that convincing to many Jews. Especially this last one was not. Circumcision. Jews circumcise their baby boys. Barnabas thinks this is a ridiculous literal interpretation. You shouldn't. No, you're not supposed to be circumcising your baby boy. What is circumcision? Barnabas points out that that God gave the sign of circumcision to Abraham. And Barnabas talks about how Abraham was told to circumcise the 318 servants of his that went off to save the nephew of Abraham, Lot, who had been captured by some other foreign kings. And so he circumcised 318. And so what does that mean? Why 318? Well, Barnabas points out that in the Greek Old Testament, 318, the way that ancient languages wrote out numbers was by taking letters of the alphabet, and each letter had a numerical value. And so if you write out 318 in Greek, it'd be a tau, that looks like an English T, and then a iota, which is like a J, and then an eta, which is like an E. So it's TJE. And he points out T looks like a cross. And J and E are the first two letters in the name Jesus. Circumcision is the cross of Jesus. You're not supposed to be cutting the foreskin off your baby boys. You're supposed to be believing in the cross of Jesus. It's right there in the Old Testament. Barnabas concludes that little example by saying, no one has ever learned a better lesson from me. I'm sure he's right. Barnabas thinks that the Old Testament was never a Jewish book. It's a Christian book. It's a Christian book that needs to be interpreted in light of Christian principles. Well, okay, let me give you a fourth option. The three I've given you so far are after the New Testament. What about inside the New Testament? There are various views within the New Testament, not just outside the New Testament. Let me give you one that is very surprising to my students. It's surprising because some of them have read this before, but they've never really thought about it. It's the view that you find in the Gospel of Matthew, the first gospel. In the first major teaching of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus explicitly tells his followers, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The scribes and the Pharisees for Matthew, are the highly religious Jews, and you have to keep the law better than them. What? You have to keep the law better than the most religious Jews? Yes. For Matthew, the answer is yes. That's in the New Testament? Yes, that's in the New Testament. This is the view that you find in the Gospel of Matthew. Christ did not abolish the law. Christ fulfilled the law, and his followers have to follow the law. And then Jesus proceeds to explain what he means. You've heard it said that you should not murder. I say to you, you should not only not murder, you should not get angry with someone else. You murder somebody out of anger, don't even get angry in the first place. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. don't take someone else's spouse. What I say to you is, don't even think about it. Don't even want to take your neighbor's spouse. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that the punishment should fit the crime. I say to you, turn the other cheek. Jesus radicalizes the law and makes it more difficult. He doesn't get rid of the law. Jesus doesn't say, you've heard it said that you should not commit adultery, but I say to you, you should commit adultery. He doesn't get rid of the law. He makes the law harder in Matthew. Christ's followers have to do this, have to do the law even more strictly than the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus himself is portrayed as the new Moses in Matthew's gospel. Jesus goes up on the mount and he delivers an interpretation of the law of Moses, because for Matthew's gospel, Jesus is the new Moses. He's not a new Moses who replaces the old Moses. The old Moses is still there, but Jesus gives his interpretation of the law, which now has to be followed. So you have to follow the law, and you have to follow Jesus' interpretation of the law. It's an interesting question whether the Gospel of Matthew thinks that the followers of Jesus have to be Jews. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, because Matthew doesn't come out and say. When Matthew does talk about the laws that people have to follow, in every case it's things like adultery and murder and turning the other cheek and so on and so on. It's not. He doesn't talk about laws like laws of circumcision or kosher food. So it's hard to know. Does Jesus want his followers to keep everything in the law? Some scholars think the answer is yes, that Matthew wanted his followers to be Jews. And others think the answer is no, that maybe he's just interpreting maybe ethical laws instead of ritual laws. It's an open question. What's not an open question is that Matthew had a high evaluation of the law and thought that Jesus' followers had to follow the law rigorously. Jesus' own interpretation of the law, in a sense, becomes the new law. You have to follow not just the prescriptions of Moses, but Jesus' interpretation of the prescriptions of Moses. Let me take a step back now and ask what Jesus himself thought. I've talked about what the Marcionites thought Jesus taught, and what the Ebionites thought Jesus taught, what Barnabas thought Jesus taught, and now what Matthew thought Jesus. What did Jesus teach? There is, as you know, an enormous range of views about what Jesus actually said during his ministry. And so I'm going to give you a rather non-controversial aspect of this. Jesus in relationship to the law. Virtually everybody that I know of who works on the historical Jesus thinks that Jesus was and meant to be law observant, that Jesus himself followed the Jewish law. Sometimes it's thought that Jesus wasn't following the law because he's breaking the Sabbath all over the place. When you actually read the New Testament Gospels, it's very hard to find any place where Jesus breaks the Sabbath. You can find places where Jesus breaks how other Jews might have interpreted how you're supposed to observe the Sabbath, but you can't really find places where Jesus actually does things that are outlawed in the law of Moses with respect to Sabbath. So there were different opinions about what it meant to observe the Sabbath, and Jesus had one set of opinions that others had different opinions about. Pretty much it looks like Jesus was law observant. Jesus was almost certainly a teacher of the law. If Jesus was a teacher of any sort, he was certainly a Jewish teacher. What does a Jewish teacher teach in the first century? He teaches the law, his interpretation of the law. So Jesus observed the law and he taught the law. Jesus did have disagreements with other teachers, especially Pharisees. Jesus wasn't the only one who had disagreements with Pharisees. Sadducees had disagreements with Pharisees. Essenes had disagreements with Pharisees. And most especially, Pharisees had disagreements with Pharisees. There were all sorts of disagreements within Judaism. It continues down to today, as you know. Jesus had disagreements with other teachers. It doesn't make him anti-Jewish or un-Jewish or non-Jewish or against the law. It simply makes him a Jewish teacher. Did Jesus plan to start a new religion? Virtually everybody who works on the historical Jesus today from a critical perspective will say the answer is no. Jesus was not planning to start some kind of new religion that was separate from Judaism. Jesus was a Jew who followed Jewish customs and kept the Jewish law, and was a Jewish teacher who had Jewish disciples whom he taught his understanding of the Jewish law. Jesus may have wanted to present his own interpretation of what it meant to be one of the people of God, but that wasn't to start a new religion, Christianity. Christianity starts after Jesus' day. It's not something that Jesus himself wanted to start. And so, if that's the case, why did Christians end up changing what it was that Jesus taught? So, this last set of points is what I'm going to conclude with. It's going to take me about 10 minutes, I think, to develop this point. After Jesus died, his followers proclaimed that he was the Jewish Messiah. It may be that some of Jesus' followers thought that he was the Messiah before he died, but it is certain that after he died, his followers were calling him the Messiah. They called him the Messiah so much and so frequently that, in fact, Messiah did become his last name. Christ becomes functioning as a name in Christianity, Jesus Christ or Jesus the Messiah. Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. What does it mean to call somebody the Messiah? Here's another thing that my students absolutely don't understand. My students tend to think that if you call somebody the Messiah, that means you're calling them God. No. Being the Messiah has nothing to do with being God for most Jews. It could have a divine influence, but for most Jews, no. Being Messiah was not being God. What was it being? So let me give you just the very brief history lesson on the term Messiah. The word Messiah in Hebrew, like the Greek word Christ, literally means anointed one. The anointed one. Originally, it was used of the kings of Israel. The king of Israel, starting with King Saul, the first king, then King David, then King Solomon. The kings were made king, say, during a coronation ceremony by having oil poured on their head. Part of the coronation ceremony, having oil poured on their head. They were anointed with oil as a sign of divine favor. God, the anointed one. The anointed one originally refers to the king, and in the Christian Old Testament, in the book of 2 Samuel, the second king, the great King David, is told by God that he will always have a descendant sitting on the throne. David will always have a descendant sitting on the throne, the kingly throne, and so there will always be a Davidic king in Jerusalem. So that was true for about 400 years. There was a dynasty, a Davidic dynasty, where there was a king on the throne, until the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem and took the king off the throne. What are people supposed to make of this promise of God that there will always be a Davidic king on the throne, an anointed one on the throne, if there's no longer a king on the throne? Some Jewish thinkers started to think that there'd be a future king on the throne. A future anointed one. The Messiah was that future anointed one, a king like David, a great political, military leader who would sit on the throne and reestablish Israel as a state, as a kingdom. By the time of Jesus, there were people who expected that the future Messiah would be that kingly figure. There were other Jews who had other expectations about what a future anointed one would be. There were some who thought that this future figure who led Israel would be more of a cosmic figure, a divine-like being who would come from heaven to destroy the enemies of God and set up God's kingdom on earth. Call him the Messiah, call him the Son of Man, call him, there were various things they called him, this future one. There were other Jews who expected that the future ruler of Israel would be a great priest who would interpret the law of God for his people and rule over his people with a very stern fist, but as a great interpreter of the law, a powerful priest who would rule the people. There are various expectations about what the Messiah would be like, but one thing all of these expectations had in common was that the Messiah would be a future figure of grandeur and power who would rule over the people of Israel, typically would overthrow the enemy and set up Israel as its own kingdom. A figure of grandeur and power. Christians came along and they said, Jesus is the Messiah. There was a very real problem with that declaration. Everyone knew that Jesus had been crucified. Jesus did not destroy the enemy and set up a kingdom in Israel. Jesus was destroyed by the enemy. Jesus was publicly tortured to death, humiliated and tortured to death. That's the Messiah? That's not the Messiah. That's the opposite of the Messiah. So when I try to get my students to understand what it's like for a first century Jew to agree Jesus is the Messiah, a crucified criminal is the Messiah, what I used to do, I can't do it anymore because now my students don't remember who David Koresh was. But what I used to do was I would say that the kind of gut feeling you'd have by saying Jesus is the Messiah is a gut feeling that you yourself would have if I told you that I think David Koresh is the Lord of the universe. David Koresh, you mean that guy at Waco, the Branch Davidian, and stockpiling arms and abusing kids and who got killed by the FBI? That's the Lord of the universe? Yes, that's the Lord of the universe. What are you, crazy? So I used to get in trouble in this in my class because every year I'd get my course evaluations back. I'd get about a half a dozen who would say, I can't believe that Ehrman thinks that David Koresh is the Lord of the universe. Okay, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's just David Koresh is the opposite for most people at least. So Christians said that Jesus was the Messiah, and most Jews absolutely rejected it. The vast majority of Jews did and do reject this claim. While the early Christians are proclaiming that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, you have the phenomenon of the Apostle Paul. Paul himself was a Jew, was a Pharisee, was apparently a strict and highly religious Jew who, because of the vision that he had of Jesus, came to think that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Paul came to think, apparently maybe at his conversion, right after his conversion, came to think that Jesus' death was absolutely the key to salvation, to being made right with God. And that since Jesus' death is what made people right with God, nothing else had any relationship to being right with God. It was only the death and resurrection of Jesus that mattered. Paul had been raised as a law-observant Jew who thought that the law really mattered. But he came to think that when it came to a relationship with God, the law actually didn't matter. Because if the law mattered, God wouldn't have had Jesus die. Paul knew that God had Jesus die because Paul knew that Jesus had been raised from the dead. If Jesus got raised from the dead, the only way he'd get raised from the dead is if God raised him. If God raised him, that shows that God favored him. If God favored him, then his death must have been something God planned. His death must be some kind of sacrifice for others. But that means that it's the sacrifice of Jesus that matters, not the law. And so Paul came to think that people could be right with God, could have salvation apart from the law by believing in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so Paul saw himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. He wanted to convert Gentiles. And he did. He started his Gentile mission. Paul converted Gentiles, and Paul had much more success than his counterparts who were trying to convert Jews. Mainly Gentiles were converting to Christianity. If you've got a situation where most Jews are rejecting the message of Jesus, and most of the people who are accepting the message of Jesus are Gentiles who don't keep the Jewish law, why do Christians keep the Old Testament? Why do Christians keep the law if they're not going to follow the law? And why even have an Old Testament? There are lots of reasons why historically Christianity kept the Old Testament. Let me give you one of the reasons that most people have not thought of. During Paul's day, after Paul's day, Christians found opposition from their pagan neighbors and from the Roman rulers on some occasions. Christians were attacked for a reason that might not make much sense today, but made a lot of sense in the ancient world. When it came to ancient religion and philosophy, ancient people really liked antiquity. In the ancient world, people liked ancient stuff. If you were a new religion, there was something wrong. You had to have an old religion. Religions had to be old to be acceptable. Philosophies had to be around for a while to be accepted. You've got to have antiquity. Christians had to have the Old Testament because it gave them antiquity. They could claim that their religion was as old as Moses. Moses predicted Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. The law was looking forward to Jesus. And so Christians had to have the Old Testament, and they claimed the Old Testament, and they claimed the Old Testament was theirs and not the Jews. Because if the Jews could rightly claim it, then the Christians could not rightly claim it. Christians wanted to rightly claim it because they needed antiquity in order to have any credentials at all in the ancient world. Even though they had the law of Moses, most Christians chose not to follow the law of Moses. Most Christians were Gentile. They didn't circumcise their baby boys. They didn't follow kosher food laws. They didn't observe the Sabbath. They didn't keep the Jewish festivals. They didn't do the other parts of the law. They didn't keep the law, but they did want to keep the words of Jesus because they understood that the words of Jesus were a kind of new law. Jesus is the one who tells us how we should live. We keep the Old Testament because it provides us with our ancient roots, but actually we follow the laws given by Jesus. And the question is, are these laws given by Jesus meant to be reinterpretations of the law, or are they meant to be replacements of the law? This was an issue that different Christians had different views on, as we have seen. There remained Christians and still remain Christians who think that Christians should still follow the Jewish laws. Other Christians think that the law is an important part of the Christian canon, but it's not to be followed. My sense is that there are a lot of Christians in the world today who think that we have the law, we have the Old Testament, but they aren't really sure why they have the Old Testament. This was a source of confusion in the ancient world, and I think it continues to be a source of confusion today. Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If people have questions, there are microphones here, and you need to come up to the mic if you want to ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Would you say a few words about the love theme in the teaching of Jesus and what your thoughts are about it?
Yeah, the love theme in the teaching of Jesus. So we have this passage in Matthew where an expert of the law, a lawyer, comes up to Jesus and asks him, Master, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, Jesus replies by quoting a passage from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, that the greatest commandment is you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And then he says the second commandment is equal to this, which is, and then he quotes Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus then says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, as with most of the things that Jesus says in the New Testament, it's very hard to know if this is actually something Jesus said, or if it's something that Matthew simply said that Jesus said, or if it's something else. But it does seem like this teaching of love is a consistent teaching throughout a lot of the sayings of Jesus. And so there are a lot of scholars who have said that Jesus understood that Jesus understood that the entire law could be summed up in this idea that you should love God, love your neighbor, and that doesn't absolve you from like following the other parts of the law, but it means that if you really want to get to the heart of the law, that's the heart of the law. And personally, I'm inclined to that teaching. I'm inclined to thinking that is an essence of what Jesus that Jesus was less concerned with a lot of kind of fine point niceties, and was really concerned with the heart of the law, which he saw as the dual love commandment. Yes.
So I'm sure I've read scholarship that indicates that James, Peter, some of the disciples immediately in the aftermath of the crucifixion were highly observant as traditional Jews. If that's true, how was that understood by the early, second century Christians?
Yeah.
And how was it incorporated into this view as to, it's clear what Paul was doing, but as for the behavior of those disciples in Jerusalem specifically, how is that dealt with in it's 2,000 years afterwards?
Yeah, great. So what I want to do is kind of differentiate two things. One is what was really the case with Peter and James and what they were really doing. And the other is how they were later understood. So Peter and James, I think, probably remained observant Jews. And what the Ebionites claimed that their teachings went back to James. So that James, the highly observant Jew, and this is the true interpretation given to us by Jesus' brother, and so we continue to follow the law. Other Christians in the second century got around that problem simply by denying it. Well, actually, no, Peter and James, they realized that Jesus abolished the law, so they came up with something else. So historically, I think Peter and James probably, so these Ebionites are probably less like most Christians today than most of these other early groups. But in some ways, they might have been representing the earliest form of Christianity, which is interesting because what it means is that as Christianity develops, what ends up being declared a heresy may have been the original form. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I don't know if many people, and perhaps I'm right or wrong, but Bart has a fantastic blog that he's had going, and it's raised a lot of money. Bart, I would like you to speak to some of your favorite parts of this blog that you've been doing. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, yeah, let me say something about the blog. I try to say something about this in public events. So I have a blog. It's called the Bart Ehrman blog. If you're interested in it, look up the Bart Ehrman blog. You'll find it. So the deal with this blog is I post 5 or 6 times a week and about 1,000 words a day on everything having to do with the New Testament, Jesus, early Christianity, the apostolic fathers, the books that didn't make it into the New Testament, the history of Christianity, the persecution of Christians, the role of women in Christianity, the Hebrew Bible, Greco-Roman world. Whatever. I deal with masses of stuff. This thing's been going on for 4.5 years. The only catch is to get on the blog, you have to pay. I charge $24.95 for a year's subscription, $24.95. Now, the reason I do this is because I give every penny to charity. And so the blog is a way for me to raise money for charity. It's the I mean, I do it because I want to communicate knowledge, but frankly, if it weren't for charity, I wouldn't do it because it takes too much time. So I raise money for charity in this blog, and so you should consider joining it. This last year, the blog raised $117,000. So it's it's real money. So and I give to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. So anyway, if you're interested in the kind of things I've been talking about today, this kind of stuff is like going on the blog all the time, and it's not much money. I mean, it's like what is it, 50 cents a week that you pay, but it piles up when you get a lot of people on it. So yeah, so thank you for the pitch, and I hope people will think about joining it. So just Google the Bart Ehrman blog. Yes.
So a question that's been much on my mind recently, I'd like to get your comments on. What was, if anything, the relationship between Jesus and the Essene movement? Was Jesus an Essene? Was this a context he was operating out of?
Yes, thank you. So for those of you who don't know, the Essenes are usually thought of as the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know about the Essenes from several sources. We knew about them before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it was quickly thought that probably this was produced by a group of Essenes. So to kind of summarize the Essenes in a very kind of simple way, the Essenes maintained that they wanted to preserve their own purity, their ritual purity, in away from the pollutions of the world. And so the Essene community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls actually started kind of like a monastic-like community off in the wilderness, where they wouldn't be influenced by other people in the world, including other Jews, including like the Sadducees and the Pharisees and stuff. And so they were starting their own. They had this own community. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, one of the first thoughts that some people had was, maybe this explains the origins of Christianity. Maybe you get this group off in the wilderness declaring that the end is coming soon, and that people need to be ready for the coming end, and that sounds like Christianity. And so maybe like Jesus was an Essene, or maybe John the Baptist was an Essene, and so this became an important topic, and for many people continues to be an important topic. So let me tell you my view of it, which is I don't think Jesus was an Essene or connected with the Dead Sea Scroll community. One of the real reasons for that is that I think that his impulse in some ways was just the opposite. So for the Essenes, the idea is you need to remove yourself from impurity so that you yourself are not made impure. And Jesus had just the opposite. I mean, Jesus is accused of hanging out with the tax collectors and sinners and the prostitutes, and so he's got the opposite approach, and so it doesn't sound like an Essene to me. So then the question is, well, was John the Baptist an Essene? He's off in the wilderness. He's talking about the coming kingdom, and so it's possible, but I think there's really no evidence that he was with the Essene, and the Essenes are not out there trying to get converts. I mean, John the Baptist is like baptizing people, wanting people to come to him, and the Essenes are more not like that. So I don't think, what I think is going on is you get different movements in Judaism at the time who are thinking that the end of the age is coming soon, and they have various ways of approaching that. And the Essenes have a way, John the Baptist has a way, Jesus has a way, and then the followers of Jesus end up being a different way. So it's not that they're all like connected to each other directly, it's that they're all sharing the same basic worldview, in my opinion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know how familiar you might be with Breslov Hasidus.
I'm sorry, with?
I know it's not your area of expertise, it's many centuries later, but Breslov Hasidut.
No, I'm not.
Okay, there's the concept that the Tzaddik suffers on behalf of the people, and he can die to atone for their sins. This being applicable for many Tzaddikim, righteous people. Do you think that this is perhaps why Paul stressed the death of Jesus so much, because this kind of atoning death also was pertaining to Gentiles in his view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to know where Paul and others are getting their ideas about the death of Jesus leading to some kind of atonement. It's so hard to know where this is coming from. Is it coming from traditional Jewish understandings of sacrifice, for example? Does he think this replaces the sacrificial system in the temple? Was there some previous kind of existing theology that he's buying into? I just don't think we have the sources of information in order to know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Jesus was a Jew, and we have the Hebrew Bible as part of our Bible. How did anti-Semitism become part of Christianity?
Right, yes. I see I have 30 seconds to answer this question. Right. How did anti-Semitism become? Okay, well, actually, it's related to what I was saying, I think, at the end of this lecture. So it's obviously a very long, it's obviously a very long, complicated story. First thing, I do not use the term anti-Semitism with respect to the ancient world. I think the idea of anti-Semitism, I'm just talking about the term. The term is applicable, I think, to the modern world, starting with the development of anthropological theories of race that you especially get starting in the 19th century, where being a Semite means belonging to a race, and it's a matter of blood. It's birth and blood. Before the development of these race theories, the problem wasn't Semitic blood. The problem was being a Jew. And so if you could convert a Jew to being a Christian, then that was fine. But during the Holocaust, if you were a Jew converted to Christian, it didn't matter because you were still a Semite. See, that's even more insidious. So with the ancient world, I don't think we're talking about anti-Semitism. We're talking about the opposition to Jews. And you don't get a lot of opposition to Jews as Jews prior to Christianity. Of course, you get Greeks and Romans who make fun of Jews, but they make fun of everybody who's not a Greek or a Roman. So, Jews were not kind of separated off and attacked most of the time. Where you do start getting opposition to Jews for being Jews is in Christianity, and it's because of what I was saying at the end, which is most Jews simply rejected the Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah. This is the very heart of the Christian claim. This is the essence of Christianity, that Jesus is the Messiah, and most Jews rejected this claim. Christians, for reasons of their own, wanted to claim that the Jewish scriptures were their scriptures. And so Christians are feeling rejection from the Jews, and they want to hold on to the Jewish scriptures, even though the Jews, and it just leads to antagonism. And so you start getting antagonism already in the New Testament period, and you have reflections of this antagonism in the Gospels, where in the Gospel of Matthew, the Roman governor who crucified Jesus washes his hands and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood." And all the people, it says, all the people cried out, "His blood be upon us and our children." The Jewish people taking responsibility for the death of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, written later, Jesus is talking to a group of Jews, and they're called the Jews, as if it's all the Jews. And he has this controversy with them. And in chapter 8, Jesus says that they're not the children of God, they're the children of the devil. Wow. So this is just already in the New Testament. When you get into the 2nd century, the vast majority of Christians are Gentile. You get a few Jews on the margins, like the Ebionites, but Christians, in order to justify their own theology and their own beliefs, have to reject Jews, and they do, and it leads to the Epistle of Barnabas. And later in that century, it leads to Melito of Sardis. Melito of Sardis is a preacher who we knew of his existence. We didn't know really what he thought or said until a discovery of a sermon of his in the 1940s. In the sermon, he preached on the occasion of the Jewish Passover feast, in which he declared that Jesus was the true Passover and that the Jews rejected their own Passover lamb, but more than that, Jesus actually was God. And the Jews killed him. which means, according to Melito, that Jews killed their own God. So Melito is the first to charge Jews with deicide, the murder of God. And so the thing is, when you have people in the 2nd century saying things like this, like Barnabas or Melito, when they're saying things like this, they are a tiny little minority, and Jews are a fairly substantial group. So at this time, there might be something like, at the time of Melito, there might be something like, I don't know, 4 million Jews in the Roman Empire, and maybe like, a couple 100,000 Christians. And so they're the tiny minority. The problem is Christianity took off and it became massive. And in the 4th century, it took over the Roman Empire. By the end of the 4th century, there's something like 30 million Christians in the world. And the reason that is a problem is because those later Christians started taking that earlier rhetoric seriously and started acting out on it. That if Jews hate God and God hates Jews, well, if we're on God's side, we're going to hate Jews. And in fact, if God's going to punish Jews, we need to punish Jews. And so by the end of the 4th century, you start getting very serious anti-Jewish legislation passed by Roman emperors. And that just leads then to the whole history of anti-Judaism through the Middle Ages and down to the history of anti-Semitism in the modern world. It's a very ugly history. And it's not a history that had to happen, and it's not a history that has to continue, because Jesus was a Jew, and his followers are Jews, and so obviously there can be very positive coexistence, and there needs to be, even though of course in some places there's not. I need to stop there. My time is up. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.